On a raw September morning in the year 954, on a stretch of road where the Pennine Hills rise bare and windswept above the valleys of northern England, a man lay dying in the heather. The rain had come in from the west overnight, and now it fell in sheets across the moorland, pooling in the ruts of the old Roman road and running in rivulets down the slopes toward the distant river. The man was perhaps 60 years old, though he looked older, his face weathered by decades of salt wind and northern cold, his beard gray and matted with blood. He wore a mail shirt of the finest Norwegian work, the rings rusting now in the wet, and beside him lay a sword with a pommel of silver and jet, a weapon fit for a king. Around him, scattered across the road and the bracken on either side, lay the bodies of his companions, perhaps a dozen men, their cloaks sodden and their wounds still bleeding into the dark peat soil. The ambush had been swift and professional. The attackers had known the road, they had known the timing, they had known their target. The dying man had been a king. He had been a king twice, in fact, once in Norway and once in England, and he had lost both crowns through violence and betrayal. His name was Eric, and history would remember him by an epithet that captured something essential about his character, something cold and brutal and absolute. They called him Bloodaxe. He could not have known, as the light faded from his eyes on that desolate moor, that he was witnessing the end of an age. The Viking kingdom of York, which had endured for nearly a century as the great Scandinavian stronghold in the British Isles, would not survive him. Within weeks of his death, the city would submit to the English king Edred, and the line of Norse rulers that had governed northern England since the great invasions of the 9th century would be extinguished forever. The heather would grow over the stones where he fell, and the wind would erase the memory of his passing, and the world would move on into a future where the old gods were forgotten and the longships rotted on their beaches, and the warrior culture that had shaped him from birth dissolved into the Christian kingdoms of medieval Europe. But that morning, in the rain and the blood and the dying, none of that was visible. What was visible was simply this: a man who had sailed across half the known world, who had commanded armies and ruled cities, and stood in the presence of both Christian kings and pagan priests, lying broken on an English road, betrayed by the men who had sworn to protect him, watching the gray sky darken toward black. This is the story of Eric Bloodaxe. It is a story of fathers and sons, of brothers turned against brothers, of crowns won through blood and lost through treachery. It is a story about the nature of power in a world without stable institutions, where kingdoms rose and fell on the strength of a single sword arm and the loyalty of a few hundred sworn men. It is a story about the collision of civilizations, about the slow death of the old Norse world and the birth of the Christian kingdoms that would replace it. And it is, in the end, a story about exile, about what it means to be cast out from everything you were born to rule, and about the desperate, doomed attempt to build a new kingdom from the wreckage of the old. To understand Eric, we must begin with the world that made him. The Norway of the late 9th century was not a kingdom in any sense that a modern person would recognize. It was a collection of territories, really, a patchwork of petty realms and independent chieftaincies scattered along the narrow strip of habitable land between the mountains and the sea. The geography of the country determined everything. Norway is essentially a long coastline, over 1,000 miles from the fjords of the south to the Arctic reaches of the north, but nowhere more than a few dozen miles wide between the ocean and the mountain spine that separates it from Sweden. The valleys run perpendicular to the coast, deep glacial trenches that cut inland toward the highlands, and each valley was effectively a separate world, isolated from its neighbors by terrain that made overland travel nearly impossible for much of the year. In this landscape, power was necessarily local. A chieftain might control a single fjord and the farms around it, or a cluster of valleys, or a stretch of coastal islands. But consolidating authority over a larger area required either impossible logistics or overwhelming military force. The sea was the highway, the only reliable means of moving men and goods from one region to another, and the men who mastered the sea were the men who accumulated power. This was the world of the early Viking Age, a world of raiders and traders and small kings constantly jockeying for advantage, where a successful voyage could transform a poor farmer into a wealthy chieftain, and a failed expedition could mean death in a foreign land. Into this world, around the year 850, came a man named Harold, later called Fairhair, who would transform it utterly. The sagas tell us that Harold was the son of a minor king in the southeast of Norway, and that as a young man he fell in love with a woman named Gyda, the daughter of a neighboring chieftain. When he sent men to propose marriage, she refused him, saying she would not waste her maidenhood on a king who ruled only a few districts, and that she would only marry a man who had made himself master of all Norway, as Gorm had made himself master of Denmark and Eric of Sweden. The young Harold, stung by her rejection, made a vow. He would not cut or comb his hair until he had conquered the entire country and made himself sole king over all the Norse lands. It took him 10 years, but he did it. This story is almost certainly legendary in its details, but it captures something true about Harold's achievement. Through a combination of military genius, strategic marriage alliances, and ruthless elimination of rivals, he managed to do what no Norwegian king had done before: impose a single authority over the fractious chieftains of the coast. The culminating battle came around 872 at Hafrsfjord, near modern Stavanger, where Harold's fleet defeated a coalition of opposing chieftains in a naval engagement that the sagas remember as one of the great battles of the age. After Hafrsfjord, resistance collapsed, and Harold was acknowledged as king of all Norway. But what Harold built was fragile. He had no bureaucracy, no standing army, no system of taxation that could function without his personal presence. His authority rested on the loyalty of the chieftains he had conquered and the fear that his warriors inspired. To maintain that authority, he needed heirs who could continue his work, and so he married prolifically, taking wives and concubines from every powerful family in the kingdom and fathering sons by all of them. The sagas give different numbers, some claiming as many as 20 sons, others more, but all agree that Harold's household was crowded with princes, each with his own mother's family backing his claims, each eyeing his brothers with suspicion and calculation. Among this crowd of rivals, one son stood apart. His name was Eric, and he was, by every account that survives, his father's favorite. Eric was born around 885 when Harold was at the height of his power. His mother was Ragnhild, a Danish princess, which gave him connections to the royal house of Denmark that none of his half-brothers could match. From earliest childhood, he was groomed for kingship. The sagas describe him in terms that are almost too perfect: the ideal Viking prince, tall, strong, handsome, skilled with weapons, brave in battle, generous to his followers. But they also note something else: a coldness in him, a capacity for violence that went beyond what even the brutal standards of the age considered normal. He was proud, they say, and quick to take offense, and utterly without mercy toward anyone who crossed him. When Eric was 12 years old, his father gave him command of a longship and sent him out to prove himself in the traditional manner of Norse princes, by raiding. This was the institution of the Viking expedition, the journey abroad for plunder and glory that marked the transition from boyhood to manhood. Eric took to it with enthusiasm. Over the next several years, he led raids in the Baltic, attacking the coasts of Finland and Karelia, then sailed into the White Sea to fight the Bjarmians, the mysterious peoples of the Russian north who traded furs and walrus ivory. He sailed west to raid in the British Isles and Ireland, where the Norse had been active for a century, and south to harry the coasts of the Frankish kingdoms. By the time he returned to Norway, he was a seasoned warrior with a reputation for ferocity that preceded him. It was during these voyages, according to the sagas, that he acquired the epithet that would define him forever. The name Bloodaxe, Bloodaxe in Old Norse, is striking and specific. It does not simply mean bloody in the sense of violent, though Eric was certainly that. The compound suggests something more literal: an axe drenched in blood, perhaps the blood of kin. Later writers would connect the name to Eric's murders of his brothers, the campaign of fratricide that would eventually cost him his kingdom. But the name may have attached itself to him earlier, during his raiding years, for some particularly savage act that the sources do not record. What is certain is that by the time Eric returned to his father's court as a young man in his 20s, He was known throughout the Norse world as a killer, a man who solved problems with the blade and felt no apparent remorse for the blood he shed. It was also during his travels, possibly in Denmark, possibly in the far north of Norway, that Eric encountered the woman who would become his queen. Her name was Gunhild. No figure in the saga literature of the Viking Age is more contradictory, more vivid, or more troubling than Gunhild, Mother of Kings. The sources disagree about nearly everything concerning her origins, her character, and her role in the events of Eric's life. And the disagreements reveal as much about medieval attitudes toward powerful women as they do about Gunhild herself. The Norwegian and Icelandic sagas, written down in the 12th and 13th centuries, tell one story. According to them, Gunhild was the daughter of Ozur Toti, a minor Norwegian chieftain from the district of Hålogaland in the far north. As a young woman, the sagas say, she traveled to Finnmark, the Arctic territory inhabited by the Sami, to study sorcery with two Sami wizards. The Sami were renowned and feared throughout the Norse world for their magical abilities, their power to see into the future and to control the weather and to curse their enemies. Gunhild lived with these wizards in a hut in the wilderness, learning their arts, and there Eric found her during one of his northern expeditions. The sagas describe what happened next with their characteristic economy and horror. Eric killed the two wizards, took Gunhild, and married her. No reason is given for the murders, they simply happen, as violence simply happens throughout the saga literature, with a matter-of-factness that can still shock modern readers. Gunhild, for her part, seems to have gone willingly, or at least without recorded resistance. She became Eric's wife, the mother of his children, and, according to virtually every source that mentions her, his most trusted advisor and the driving force behind many of his most controversial decisions. The Danish sources tell a different story. According to them, Gunhild was not a Norwegian chieftain's daughter at all, but a Danish princess, the daughter of King Gorm the Old, who unified Denmark, and the sister of Harald Bluetooth, who converted the Danes to Christianity. This would make her one of the most powerful women in Scandinavia by birth, a connection that would have greatly strengthened Eric's position in the complex politics of the Norse world. Which story is true? Almost certainly neither, in its entirety. The Norwegian saga account has the quality of legend, of a folk motif attached to a historical figure, the dangerous woman learned in magic, taken from her uncanny teachers by a violent hero. The Danish account serves obvious political purposes, connecting the Norwegian royal family to the prestigious Jelling dynasty. Modern historians generally believe that Gunhild was probably Danish, given the strength of her son's later connections to Denmark, but that the details of her origins are irrecoverable. What we can say with more confidence is what Gunhild became. A queen who wielded real power, who advised her husband on matters of policy and war, who managed his household and raised his many sons, and who, after his death, became a political force in her own right, feared and hated for decades. The saga writers, almost without exception, despise her. They portray her as cruel, manipulative, sexually voracious, and devoted to dark magic. They blame her for Eric's worst decisions, suggest that she cuckolded him repeatedly, and claim that she used sorcery to destroy her enemies. Even allowing for medieval misogyny, the intensity of the hostility she inspires is remarkable. But hostility of this kind often signals something real. A woman who refused to stay in her prescribed role, who exercised influence openly rather than quietly, who made herself visible and consequential in a world that expected women to be neither. Gunhild, Mother of Kings, earned that epithet through her sons, several of whom would eventually rule Norway, but she also earned it through her own force of personality. She was Eric's partner in power, and she would outlive him by decades, carrying on his legacy and his vendettas long after his body lay cold on an English moor. Together, they would build a kingdom, and together, in a different sense, they would destroy it. The chronology of the late 9th and early 10th centuries in Norway is frustratingly uncertain. The sagas were written down hundreds of years after the events they describe, and they often contradict each other on matters of dating and sequence. But the broad outlines of Harald Fairhair's later reign and the crisis of succession that followed it can be reconstructed with reasonable confidence. By the 930s, Harald was an old man. He had ruled longer than any Norwegian king before him, and he had outlived most of the chieftains who had once opposed him. But age brought weakness, and weakness brought danger. His many sons, now grown men with families and ambitions of their own, began to maneuver for position. The question of who would succeed the old king consumed the kingdom. Harald's solution was to elevate Eric above his brothers, naming him co-king and designated heir while Harald still lived. This was a deliberate choice, a statement that whatever claims the older sons might make, it was Eric who would rule after Harald's death. The sagas suggest that Harald loved Eric more than his other sons, that he saw in Eric the qualities he valued most: courage, martial prowess, decisiveness. But love aside, the choice also made political sense. Eric was married to Gunhild, with her Danish connections. He had proven himself in war. He had the loyalty of a substantial personal following, and he had demonstrated, through his willingness to shed blood, that he would not hesitate to eliminate rivals. When Harald died, around the year 933, Eric assumed sole rule of Norway. His reign was a disaster. The problem was structural as much as personal. Harald's kingdom had been held together by Harald's personal authority, by the fear and respect he commanded after decades of warfare and rule. Eric inherited the kingdom, but not the authority. The chieftains who had bent the knee to Harald saw no reason to extend the same deference to his son. Eric was a successful raider and a fearsome warrior, but raiding and warfare were not the same as governance. He had little patience for the endless negotiations and compromises that Norwegian kingship required, the delicate balancing of noble interests, the cultivation of allies, the strategic distribution of rewards. Instead, Eric governed as he had raided, through direct action and overwhelming force. When his brothers disputed his authority, he killed them. The sagas record the deaths of at least 2, possibly more, in the first years of his reign. These were not battlefield deaths, not the casualties of open war, but something colder: political murders, the elimination of rivals who had committed no offense except existing. The Norwegian word for this kind of killing was fratricide, and it was regarded as one of the worst crimes a man could commit, a violation of the sacred bonds of kinship that structured Norse society. Even in a violent age, Eric's behavior shocked. The chieftains who had accepted Harald's rule began to murmur against his son. Eric, they said, was a tyrant, a killer of brothers, a man unfit to rule. And as the murmurs grew louder, they began to look around for an alternative. They found one across the sea. Among Harald Fairhair's many sons was one who had been sent away as a child, given as a foster son to the court of the English king Athelstan. His name was Hakon, and he would later be called Hakon the Good. The practice of fostering was common in the early medieval world, a way of building alliances between powerful families and educating young nobles in the ways of foreign courts. For a Norwegian prince to be fostered by an English king was a significant honor, a sign of the respect in which Harald was held and of the growing connections between the Norse and Anglo-Saxon worlds. Athelstan was no ordinary king. He was the grandson of Alfred the Great, the ruler who had saved Wessex from the Vikings and begun the long process of English unification. And by the 930s, Athelstan had made himself the most powerful king in Britain, overlord of the English, the Welsh, and the Scots. At Athelstan's court, young Hakon received an education very different from what he would have gotten in Norway. He learned Latin and letters. He was baptized into the Christian faith. He absorbed the ideas of Christian kingship that were transforming European politics, the notion that a king's authority derived from God, that he was responsible for the welfare of his people, that justice and mercy were kingly virtues alongside courage and strength. When he returned to Norway, he brought these ideas with him, and they made him fundamentally different from his brothers. The Norwegian chieftains who opposed Eric saw in Hakon everything they wanted, a prince of the royal blood who was also everything Eric was not. Where Eric was violent, Hakon was measured. Where Eric was haughty, Hakon was gracious. Where Eric demanded submission, Hakon promised consultation. And Hakon was Christian, which meant that he had connections to the growing network of Christian kingdoms that was slowly spreading across Europe, a network that could provide legitimacy and support that the old pagan alliances could not match. Around the year 935, perhaps 936, Haakon returned to Norway. He had been gone for a decade or more, a boy when he left and a man when he returned, but he was not forgotten. The chieftains rallied to him. Eric, faced with a sudden and overwhelming coalition of his former supporters, found himself isolated. He could fight, but he could not win, not against his own nobles and his own brother simultaneously. For once in his life, Eric chose discretion. He gathered his family, his retinue, and what wealth he could carry. He put them all on ships, and he sailed west into exile, away from the kingdom his father had built and that he had ruled for barely 2 years. He was perhaps 50 years old. He had been king of all Norway, and now he was nothing, a wanderer on the gray Atlantic with a wife, a crowd of children, and a few hundred loyal warriors. Behind him, the kingdom closed like water over a stone. But Eric Bloodaxe was not finished. The sea that bore him away from Norway would carry him to a new destiny, stranger and more improbable than anything he could have imagined. Across the water, in the rain and fog of northern England, an ancient city waited, and a crown that no one expected would find his head. Before we can follow Eric to England, we must understand what he was sailing toward. The British Isles in the mid-10th century were a patchwork of kingdoms, cultures, and contested boundaries, a world in violent transformation. The great invasions of the 9th century, the arrival of the great heathen army in 865, and the decades of warfare that followed had shattered the old Anglo-Saxon order. Of the 4 major English kingdoms that had existed before the invasions, 3 had been entirely conquered by the Danes, their royal families killed or driven into exile, their territories absorbed into a vast region known as the Danelaw. Only Wessex in the southwest had survived, saved by Alfred the Great's desperate resistance and his eventual counterattack. By the 930s, Alfred's descendants had transformed that survival into dominance. His son Edward the Elder and grandson Athelstan had pushed north year by year, reconquering the Danelaw piece by piece, forcing the Danish settlers to submit to English overlordship. By Athelstan's death in 939, England south of the Humber was effectively unified under the Wessex dynasty for the first time in history. It was an astonishing achievement, the creation of the Kingdom of England out of the ruins of the Viking Wars. But the north remained different. Northumbria, the great kingdom that had once stretched from the Humber to the Firth of Forth, had its own history and its own identity. Before the Vikings came, Northumbria had been the cultural center of English Christianity, home to the monastery of Lindisfarne and the great scholars of the Northumbrian Renaissance. The Viking invasions had destroyed that world, killing the monks and burning the libraries, but they had also created something new, a hybrid Norse-English society centered on the city of York. York, which the Norse called Jorvik, was one of the largest and wealthiest cities in Britain. It had been founded by the Romans nearly 1,000 years earlier, had served as the capital of Roman Britain for a time, and had never entirely lost its urban character. Under Viking rule, it had flourished as never before. The Norse brought with them trading connections that spanned the known world, from the Islamic caliphates of the Mediterranean to the fur trading posts of the Russian rivers. York became a manufacturing center, producing goods for export across the North Sea world: bone and antler combs, leather shoes, amber jewelry, ironwork, glassware. Its streets were crowded with merchants, craftsmen, and warriors speaking a dozen languages. Its population may have reached 15,000 at its peak, enormous by the standards of the age. The Vikings who ruled York were not a unified people. Some were Danes, descended from the settlers of the great heathen army. Others were Norwegians, with connections to the Norse kingdoms of Ireland and the Scottish Islands. Still others were Hiberno-Norse, the mixed-blood descendants of Vikings who had settled in Ireland and intermarried with the Irish population. These groups had different interests, different loyalties, and different ideas about who should rule them. The kingship of York changed hands repeatedly in the early 10th century, with Danish kings, Norwegian kings, and even briefly English kings claiming the throne and losing it again. What united the Northumbrians, Norse and English alike, was their distrust of the South. The kings of Wessex were foreigners to them, Southerners with Southern ways, Christians who wanted to impose their bishops and their taxes on a people who had governed themselves for generations. When Athelstan conquered York in 927, he was accepted grudgingly, an overlord rather than a king. When he died in 939, the Northumbrians immediately rebelled, expelling his representatives and inviting a Norse king from Ireland to rule them instead. This was the pattern of the 940s: English reconquest, Northern rebellion, Viking restoration, renewed English assault. The kings of Wessex had the military power to take York whenever they chose, but they could not hold it without the cooperation of the local nobility, and that cooperation was never reliable. The Northumbrians wanted a king of their own, preferably a Norse king, preferably one who would leave them alone to manage their own affairs. They were willing to submit to English overlordship if they had to, but they would always prefer a ruler who understood them. Into this volatile situation sailed Eric Bloodaxe. The details of Eric's journey from Norway to England are obscure. The sources agree that he stopped first in the Orkney Islands, the Norse-controlled archipelago off the northern tip of Scotland. The Orkneys were a natural waypoint for any ship traveling between Norway and the British Isles, and they were ruled by a jarl, a Norse nobleman, who owed nominal allegiance to the Norwegian crown. Eric may have stayed there for a time, raiding in the Scottish waters and rebuilding his resources after the disaster of his expulsion. From Orkney, he seems to have moved south, appearing at some point on the coast of Northumbria. The exact date is uncertain. Some sources place his first arrival in York as early as 947, others as late as 948. What is clear is that at some point in this period, the Northumbrian nobility invited Eric to be their king. Why would they choose him? Eric was an exile, a man who had failed spectacularly in his own kingdom, driven out by his own people. He was known throughout the Norse world as a killer of brothers, a man with a reputation for violence even by the standards of an age that celebrated violence. He brought with him not an army but a war band, a few hundred warriors at most, enough to raid but not to conquer. On the surface, he seems like an unlikely candidate for kingship. But from the Northumbrian perspective, Eric had virtues that outweighed his flaws. He was of royal blood, a son of Harold Fairhair, with a lineage as distinguished as any king in the Norse world. He had proven himself in war, which mattered more than peacetime governance to a people who lived under constant threat of English invasion. He was not Danish, which meant he would not try to subordinate Northumbria to the interests of the Danish kings who had ruled York earlier in the century. And he was available, a king without a kingdom, willing to accept whatever terms the Northumbrians offered. There may have been another factor as well. Eric's wife, Gunhild, was connected by birth or marriage to the powerful dynasties of Denmark, and those connections gave Eric access to resources and allies that other candidates lacked. The politics of the Northumbrian succession were tangled and opaque, with factions supporting different candidates and shifting allegiances from year to year. In this environment, Gunhild's intelligence and her network of contacts may have made the difference. Whatever the reasons, the invitation was extended and accepted. Around 947, Eric Bloodaxe was crowned King of York. What did he see, this Norwegian exile, when he first entered the city that would be his last kingdom? York in the mid-10th century was a city of wood and wattle, of narrow streets and crowded workshops, of churches with stone foundations and timber walls, of great halls where the nobility feasted and slave markets where human beings were bought and sold. The walls of the Roman city still stood, repaired and reinforced over the centuries, enclosing an area of roughly 100 acres on the north bank of the river Ouse. Beyond the walls, suburbs sprawled along the riverbanks and the roads leading north and south, home to the craftsmen and laborers who kept the city functioning. The heart of the city was Coppergate, the street of the cupmakers, where excavations in the 20th century would reveal the most complete picture we have of Viking urban life. The workshops here produced goods for export across the known world: combs carved from deer antler with their distinctive double-row teeth, leather shoes and boots in dozens of styles, glass beads and vessels made from recycled Roman glass, metalwork in bronze and iron, and precious metals. The workers lived above or behind their shops in small houses with sunken floors for warmth and hearths for cooking. their lives leaving traces that would survive 1,000 years: tools, clothing, food waste, the detritus of daily existence. Eric would have seen all of this, or some version of it, as he processed through the streets to the royal hall where he would take up residence. He would have heard the babble of languages, Old Norse and Old English and Irish and Latin and possibly Arabic, the tongues of a trading city at the crossroads of worlds. He would have smelled the characteristic smell of Viking York, which modern archaeologists describe as a combination of wood smoke, animal dung, rotting organic matter, and the industrial byproducts of leather tanning and metalworking. He would have seen the churches, the Christian churches that had survived the pagan invasions and converted the pagan settlers, and the great Minster of York, one of the largest churches in Britain, where archbishops had preached since the days of the early English church. And he would have seen his subjects, the people he was now called to rule, the Norse merchants and warriors who formed the urban elite, the English farmers and craftsmen who still made up the majority of the population, the Irish and Scots and Welsh who had drifted into the city from the Celtic lands to the west, the slaves who did the hardest and lowest work. This was his kingdom now, this strange hybrid city, neither fully Norse nor fully English, neither fully pagan nor fully Christian, a place suspended between worlds. What did he make of it? What did he think, this exile from the fjords of Norway, standing in a Roman city 1,000 miles from his birthplace? The sources do not tell us. They record his actions, some of them, but not his thoughts, not his feelings, not the interior life of a man who had lost everything and found himself unexpectedly king again. But we can say this much: he stayed. He took up the crown that was offered to him. He sat in the royal hall and dispensed justice and collected tribute and commanded warriors. He minted coins with his name on them, the only concrete evidence we have of his presence, small silver pennies that survive today in museums and private collections, stamped with the words, Eric Rex, Eric the King. For a few years at least, he made York his home. It would not last. The forces that had driven him from Norway were still at work, and the forces that governed England were gathering against him. But for a moment, in the smoky halls of Jorvik, the old Viking world burned bright one last time, and a man who had lost everything found himself holding a crown again. The question was how long he could keep it. The answer, as it turned out, was not long at all. To understand what happened next, we must step back from Eric and his smoky hall and consider the larger game being played across Britain in those years. The island was not a single kingdom, not yet, though it was becoming one. The descendants of Alfred the Great had spent 3 generations building something new, a unified English state, stretching from the Channel coast to the old Roman wall and beyond. Alfred's grandson Athelstan, who had fostered the young Håkon before sending him back to claim Norway, had been the first English king to style himself ruler of all Britain. He had crushed a great coalition of Norse and Scottish kings at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, a victory celebrated in Anglo-Saxon poetry as the greatest since the English first came to these shores. When Athelstan died in 939, he left behind a kingdom that stretched further than any English realm before it, and brothers who were determined to hold what he had won. But the brothers were weaker than Athelstan had been, and the north was restless. Edmund, who succeeded Athelstan, faced immediate rebellion. The Northumbrians invited a Norse king from Dublin, Olaf Guthfrithson, to rule them. And for several years, the old Viking kingdom reasserted its independence. Edmund reconquered it, lost it again, reconquered it again. When Edmund was murdered in 946, stabbed by an outlaw at a feast, his brother Edred inherited the struggle. It was Edred who would become Eric's nemesis, the relentless English king who could not tolerate a rival power in the north. Edred was an unlikely warrior. The sources describe him as sickly, unable to digest his food properly, forced to chew his meat and then spit it out. He may have suffered from some chronic digestive illness, perhaps the same kind of ailment that would kill him young, at barely 30 years old. But whatever weakness plagued his body, his will was iron. He was determined to bring Northumbria permanently under English control, and he would use whatever methods were necessary to achieve it. The first years of Eric's reign in York are poorly documented, and the chronology is confused. Different chronicles give different dates, and modern historians have spent considerable energy trying to reconcile them. What seems clear is that Eric arrived in Northumbria around 947 or 948, was accepted as king by the Northumbrian nobility, and almost immediately found himself in conflict with Edred. The English king marched north with an army, ravaging the countryside and burning the great minster at Ripon, one of the oldest and most sacred churches in the north. The Northumbrians, intimidated by this show of force, submitted to Edred and expelled Eric. But no sooner had the English army turned south than the northern nobles changed their minds again. They invited Eric back. Edred marched north again. Eric fled. The pattern repeated itself, a dizzying cycle of submissions and rebellions that speaks to the fundamental instability of the situation. The Northumbrian nobles were caught between competing imperatives. They wanted a king who could protect them from the increasingly powerful English South, but they also wanted a king who would respect their traditional rights and privileges. Eric, with his reputation for brutality and his foreign wife and her foreign ways, was not an easy master. He demanded tribute and military service and absolute loyalty, the same things he had demanded in Norway, with the same result: resentment, resistance, and ultimately betrayal. But the alternative, submission to Edred and the southern English, meant the end of Northumbrian independence, the reduction of the great northern kingdom to a mere province of a larger realm. For a generation that still remembered the days when York had been the capital of a Viking empire stretching from Dublin to the Baltic, this was a bitter pill to swallow. Into this volatile situation came another figure, another Norse king with claims to Northumbria. His name was Olaf Sitriksson, sometimes called Olaf Quarren, the sandal wearer, and he had his own long and complicated history with York and with Ireland, and with the tangled politics of the Irish Sea World. Olaf had ruled York before Eric, had been driven out by the English, had returned to Ireland to rule Dublin, and now saw an opportunity to reclaim his northern kingdom. The sources suggest that, for a time, around 950 or 951, Olaf and Eric may have shared power in some fashion, perhaps dividing the kingdom between them, or ruling in awkward tandem. The details are impossible to recover. What is clear is that by 952 or thereabouts, Eric was sole king again, Olaf had retreated to Ireland, and the final confrontation was approaching. During these turbulent years, Eric did what he could to establish himself as a legitimate ruler. He minted coins, those small silver pennies that survive today, as the most concrete evidence of his reign. The coins are fascinating objects, windows into the hybrid world of Viking York. Some bear Eric's name in Latin letters, Eric Rex, alongside the name of the moneyer who struck them, and the name of the city, Eborasi, the Latin form of York. Others bear designs borrowed from earlier Viking coinage, swords, crosses, hammers that might be Thor's or might be Christian symbols, the ambiguity perhaps deliberate. The coins circulated throughout northern England and beyond, carried by merchants and travelers, spreading the name of the Norwegian exile who had become an English king. Eric also maintained relations with the church, despite his reputation as a pagan and the dark stories about Gunhild's sorcery. Archbishop Wulfstan I of York, one of the most powerful ecclesiastical figures in Britain, seems to have cooperated with Eric's regime, or at least not actively opposed it. Wulfstan was a pragmatic man, concerned above all with maintaining the independence and privileges of his see, and he may have calculated that a Norse king who could be managed was preferable to an English king who could not be resisted. The relationship between Eric and Wulfstan is one of the great mysteries of this period. Some historians have seen Wulfstan as a secret supporter of Eric, perhaps even the architect of his return after each expulsion. Others see him as a trimmer, a survivor, a man who worked with whatever king sat on the throne while protecting his own interests. The truth is probably somewhere in between, if truth can be found at all in sources this fragmentary. What we can say is that Eric's court was not the court of a pure pagan warlord. It was the court of a king trying to rule a Christian kingdom, trying to project legitimacy in a Christian world. The Minster of York still stood, its archbishop still preached, its clergy still performed the sacraments, the merchants of the city still traded with Christian Europe, the coins still bore crosses alongside the pagan imagery. Whatever Eric believed in his heart, whatever rites Gunhild performed in their private chambers, the public face of his kingship was necessarily Christian, or at least not openly hostile to Christianity. This was the world of the Viking Age at its twilight, a world where the old gods were fading but not yet gone, where men hedged their bets and served multiple masters, where a king could be buried with pagan rites and his widow could endow a monastery for the repose of his soul. But legitimacy and coins and archiepiscopal tolerance were not enough to save Eric from his enemies. The fundamental problem remained. He was a foreign king without deep roots in the land he ruled, dependent on the loyalty of nobles who had already betrayed him once and would betray him again. And Eadred had not forgotten him. The end, when it came, was sudden and bloody. The year was 954, the late summer or early autumn, when the campaigning season was drawing to a close and the first cold winds were beginning to blow down from the north. The sources disagree about the precise sequence of events, but the broad outline is clear. Eric was driven from York for the final time. Whether he was expelled by the Northumbrian nobles acting on their own initiative, or whether Edred's pressure finally broke their resistance, or whether some combination of treachery and military force was responsible, we cannot say for certain. What is clear is that Eric found himself fleeing westward with a small band of followers, heading for the high passes of the Pennines, the route that led to the Old Norse settlements around the Solway Firth, and ultimately to the sea and the islands beyond. He never reached them. The place where Eric died is called Stainmore, a name that means stone moor in Old Norse, a high and desolate pass where the road from York to the west crosses the spine of England. Even today it is a bleak and windswept place, the highest point on the old road, where the weather can turn savage without warning, and the visibility can drop to nothing in minutes. In the 10th century, it was even wilder, a stretch of open moorland far from any settlement, the kind of place where ambushes were easy and rescue was impossible. Here, according to the sources, Eric and his companions were attacked and killed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the event with brutal brevity. And in this year, the Northumbrians expelled Eric, and Eadred succeeded to the Northumbrian kingdom. That is all. No details of the battle, no names of the killers, no description of the scene. The chronicle was written in the south by monks who cared little for the fate of a pagan Viking king, and they recorded his death as they would record the death of any enemy. As a problem solved, a threat eliminated, a footnote to the real story of English unification. The later sources give us more, though they do not agree. The Historia Regum, attributed to Simeon of Durham but compiled from earlier materials, tells us that Eric was betrayed by a Northumbrian nobleman named Osulf, who had been appointed earl under Eadred, and who ambushed Eric at Stainmore with a military force. The killing itself was done by a man named Maccus, son of Olaf, whose identity is uncertain. He may have been a Norse warrior in Osulf's service, or a rival claimant to some northern lordship, or simply a man who saw an opportunity and took it. The Historia also tells us that Eric did not die alone. His son Herrick fell with him, and a brother named Ragnald, and a Norse commander named Erland. They died together on that cold moorland, their blood soaking into the peat, their bodies left for the ravens that were sacred to Odin. The Norwegian sagas remember it differently, as the sagas always do. In the Icelandic accounts, Eric's death was the result of a conspiracy between the English king and the treacherous Northumbrians, a betrayal of sacred oaths, a violation of the bonds of loyalty that should have bound lord and man. The saga tradition is deeply concerned with loyalty and betrayal, with the keeping and breaking of oaths, and Eric's death at Stainmore fits perfectly into this moral framework. He was a king who had trusted the wrong men, who had accepted the service of those who would sell him for English gold, who had died as so many saga heroes die, surrounded, outnumbered, fighting to the last, betrayed by those closest to him. Both versions are probably true, or rather, both contain elements of truth filtered through different perspectives and purposes. Eric was killed by Northumbrians who had turned against him, probably with the encouragement and support of King Eadred, probably at Stainmore, probably in an ambush. The details beyond that are lost, but if the sources are sparse on the manner of Eric's death, They are eloquent on its meaning. With Eric's fall, the Viking kingdom of York came to an end. For nearly a century, since the great heathen army had conquered the city in 866, Norse kings had ruled in Northumbria. They had minted coins, built ships, raided and traded across the northern world. They had created a hybrid culture that blended Norse and English and Irish elements into something new and distinctive. They had maintained connections to Dublin and the Isle of Man, to Norway and Denmark, to the wider world of the Viking diaspora. All of that ended on the moor at Stainmore. Eadred moved quickly to consolidate his victory. He appointed Osulf, Eric's betrayer, as Earl of Northumbria, ruling the north in the English king's name. The great minster of York, which had burned during Eadred's earlier campaigns, was rebuilt and rededicated. The archbishops continued their work, now firmly under the authority of the Southern English Church. The Norse population of the city and the surrounding countryside was not expelled or massacred. They were simply absorbed, their language and customs gradually fading over the generations until only place names and personal names and archaeological traces remained to mark their presence. York became an English city, part of an English kingdom, and the dream of an independent northern realm passed into memory. For Gunhild and her sons, the news of Eric's death would have come across the sea, carried by survivors of the ambush or by traders or by the elaborate networks of communication that connected the Norse world. We can imagine her receiving the message in the hall of some Orkney chieftain or on the deck of a ship heading home, learning that she was a widow, that her husband had died in exile, that her sons were now fatherless. The sagas portray her as a woman of extraordinary resilience, cold and calculating where her husband had been hot and impulsive, and there's no reason to doubt that she met this news with the same iron composure. She had work to do. The sons of Eric and Gunhild were numerous and ambitious. The sources name at least 8, though the exact number is uncertain: Harold, Gamle, Ragnfrid, Gudrod, Sigurd Sleva, Erling, Gorm, and others. They had grown up in exile, raised on stories of their grandfather's greatness and their father's betrayal, and they were determined to reclaim what had been taken from them. Within a few years of Eric's death, they were back in Norway, waging war against King Haakon, the uncle who had stolen their birthright. The wars that followed were savage and prolonged. Haakon, who had seemed so secure after Eric's expulsion, now found himself fighting for his life against an entire generation of nephews. The sons of Eric were relentless. They raided the Norwegian coast, gathered supporters among the discontented nobles, and launched invasion after invasion. In 961, at the Battle of Fitjar, they finally caught Haakon with a small force and cut him down. The good king, the Christian king, the king who had been fostered in England and brought new ways to the north, died on the same shore where he had landed decades before, and the sons of Eric claimed the throne their father had lost. But the victory was hollow. Harold, the eldest surviving son, became king, but his rule was troubled from the beginning. He earned the nickname Grey Cloak, either for the drab clothing he wore or for the poverty of his kingdom, which had been devastated by years of civil war. The Norwegian nobles who had supported the sons of Eric against Haakon quickly grew disenchanted with their new masters. The old complaints revived: the foreign queen with her sorcery, the excessive demands for tribute, the contempt for traditional rights. Within a few years, Harold Greycloak was dead too, killed in an ambush in Denmark, and the kingdom passed to other hands. Gunhild outlived them all. The sagas say she fled to Denmark after Harold's death, then to the Orkneys, and finally disappeared from history around the year 980, an old woman who had been queen of 2 kingdoms and mother of kings, and had seen everything she loved destroyed. The later Icelandic tradition remembers her as a witch, a schemer, a woman who brought ruin to everyone she touched. But this is the memory of her enemies, written down generations later by men who had every reason to blacken her name. The truth of Gunhild, like the truth of Eric, lies somewhere beneath the layers of legend and propaganda, irrecoverable now. And what of Eric himself? How do we assess a life like his, a career that began in the halls of Harold Fairhair and ended in the heather of an English moor? The temptation is to see him as a failure, a man who lost 2 kingdoms, who was expelled by his own people twice over, who died in ambush far from home. By almost any conventional measure of success, Eric Bloodaxe was unsuccessful. He held Norway for less than 5 years before being driven out. He held York for perhaps 6 years in total, though probably not continuously, before being killed. He left no lasting dynasty. His sons achieved temporary victories, but no permanent settlement. His name passed into legend, but not into the kind of legend that shapes nations. He is remembered today mainly for his epithet, that brutal sobriquet that captures something essential about the Viking Age, its violence, its starkness, its willingness to call things by their true names. But to judge Eric only by his failures is to miss what made him significant. He was a transitional figure, a man who stood at the hinge point between two worlds. Behind him lay the old Viking Age, the age of raiders and adventurers, of kings who ruled by the strength of their sword arms and the loyalty of their war bands. Ahead of him lay the new Europe that was emerging from the chaos of the 9th and 10th centuries, a Europe of consolidated kingdoms and established churches, of written laws and administrative structures, of borders and boundaries, and the slow replacement of personal loyalty with institutional authority. Eric belonged to the old world, and the old world was dying. In Norway, the future belonged to men like Hakon the Good, who had learned the ways of the English court and brought Christianity back with him. It belonged to Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, the missionary kings who would complete the conversion of Norway by persuasion and by force. It belonged to the administrators and lawgivers who would transform the scattered chiefdoms of the north into something resembling a medieval kingdom. Eric's style of kingship, personal, violent, and uncompromising, had no place in this new order. In England, the future belonged to the House of Wessex, to Edred and his successors, to the slow and painful process of building a unified English state. The Viking kingdoms of the north were not conquered so much as absorbed. Their populations gradually assimilated into an English-speaking, church-going, tax-paying populace. By the time of the Norman conquest a century later, York was simply an English city with some funny place names, its Viking past a fading memory. Eric's brief reign was one of the last moments when another future seemed possible, when the North might have remained Norse and independent, connected to the wider world of the Scandinavian diaspora, rather than to the Kingdom of England. He could not have known this. He could not have known that he was the last of anything, that the kingdom he was fighting to hold would never exist again after his death. He was simply a man trying to survive, trying to hold together what he had been given, trying to find a place in a world that had no place for him. The saga writers understood this in their way. That is why they composed the Eiríksmal. This poem, The Words of Eric, is one of the most remarkable documents of the Viking Age. It was composed shortly after Eric's death, probably by a poet at the court of his son Harald Greycloak, and it imagines Eric's arrival in Valhalla, the hall of the slain, where Odin gathers the warriors who die in battle. The poem opens with Odin waking from a dream. He has dreamed of preparing his hall for a great guest, of setting up benches and brewing mead, of readying Valhalla for an arrival that will shake the worlds. He speaks to Bragi, the god of poetry, asking who comes with such thunder and commotion. The dead heroes Sigmund and Sinfjotli, legendary warriors who had preceded Eric to Valhalla, rise to greet the newcomer. They have recognized him. It is Eric, king of Norway, come to join the host of the slain. Odin asks why, if Eric was such a great warrior, he was deprived of victory in his final battle. The answer, put in the mouth of the dead heroes, is striking. Because the gray wolf watches the abodes of the gods. This cryptic phrase refers to Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when the wolf Fenrir will devour Odin himself. The gods need warriors like Eric, not for his earthly victories, but for the final battle at the end of time. His death was not a defeat, but a summoning. Eric enters the hall, and Odin welcomes him by name, inviting him to drink the mead of the gods. Eric asks who will follow him, who else will come to Valhalla from this day's work. 5 kings, he is told, 5 kings have fallen with him. Eric does not mourn. He has come home. The poem is short, perhaps 50 lines in total, but its ambitions are enormous. It takes a failure, a man killed in ambush on a foreign moor, and transforms him into a hero whose death has cosmic significance. It refuses to accept the judgment of history, the verdict of the men who killed him, and the kingdoms that absorbed his. It insists that there's another scale of value, another measure of greatness, and by that measure, Eric Bloodaxe was not a failure, but a champion. Whether anyone believed this, in the literal sense of believing that Eric was feasting in Valhalla while the world moved on without him, is impossible to say. By the time the poem was composed, Christianity was spreading rapidly through the Norse world. Håkon the Good had been a Christian. Harald Greycloak was probably baptized. The old gods were becoming literary ornaments, figures from stories rather than objects of genuine worship. The Eiríksmal may have been a sincere expression of pagan piety, or it may have been a nostalgic exercise in a dying tradition, or it may have been simply a political document, a piece of propaganda designed to burnish the reputation of a disgraced king for the benefit of his surviving sons. What it certainly was, and what it remains, is a window into a vanishing world. The world where men believed that death in battle was not an ending but a beginning. The world where kings were judged not by the size of their kingdoms, but by the fierceness of their courage. The world where a man could lose everything and still be counted great if he lost it with a sword in his hand. That world was passing. Eric Bloodaxe was one of the last men to fully inhabit it, and when he fell at Stainmore, betrayed and outnumbered and far from home, something fell with him that would never rise again. The moor is still there. The road still crosses it, though now it is a modern highway, the A66, carrying trucks and cars between the east coast and the west. There is nothing to mark the exact spot where Eric died. No monument, no plaque, no memorial. The land itself is unchanged, rolling hills of brown heather, outcrops of gray stone, the wind moving endlessly across the open ground. On a clear day you can see for miles. On a day when the clouds come down, you can barely see the road ahead. Somewhere out there, over 1,000 years ago, a man who had been king of 2 countries took his last breath. The ravens came, as they always came. The bodies were stripped, as bodies always were. And the long, slow work of forgetting began. But not everyone forgot. Gunhild did not forget. Her sons did not forget. And in the cold halls of exile, in the wind-scoured islands of Orkney where they had first taken shelter, the family of Eric Bloodaxe began to plan their return. The sources for what follows are fragmentary and often hostile. Gunhild herself left no account. Her sons left no written records. What we have are the sagas composed centuries later and the brief, tantalizing references in the histories of Norwegian and English chroniclers who had little love for any of them. From these scattered fragments, a picture emerges of a woman who refused to accept defeat and of sons who grew up in the shadow of their father's memory, raised on stories of betrayal and exile, trained from childhood for the wars of vengeance that would consume the rest of their lives. They were many, the sons of Eric and Gunhild. The sources give different names and different numbers, but the most commonly accepted list includes at least 5 who reached adulthood and made their mark on history. Harald, called Greycloak, Gamle, which means simply the old, Erling, Gudrod, and Ragnfrud. There may have been others. There were certainly daughters, though their names and fates are largely lost. What is clear is that Gunhild raised them not as exiles content to live quietly in some corner of the Norse world, but as princes in waiting, heirs to kingdoms that had been stolen from them, instruments of a revenge that would take decades to complete. The first target was obvious. Håkon, their father's youngest half-brother, had taken the throne of Norway. He had driven their father into exile. He had won the loyalty of the nobles who should have served the sons of Eric. And now he sat in the halls that had belonged to Harald Fairhair, ruling the kingdom that Eric had briefly held and that his sons considered their birthright. Håkon called himself the Good, a title that later historians would largely accept. He was wise and popular, a Christian who nevertheless tolerated the old religion, a king who ruled with consent rather than terror. Everything, in other words, that Eric Bloodaxe had not been. The sons of Eric spent years raiding and building their forces. They operated from bases in Denmark, where Gunhild's connections to the Danish royal house gave them refuge and support. They made alliances with discontented Norwegian nobles, with Danish warlords, with anyone who had reason to oppose Hakon's rule. And periodically, when they had gathered enough ships and men, they sailed for Norway and war. The campaigns blur together in the sources, a series of raids and counter-raids, of battles whose locations are given in names that scholars still argue over. What is clear is that the sons of Eric were persistent, capable, and utterly ruthless. They burned farms and villages. They killed men who had served their father and then betrayed him. They announced themselves as the legitimate heirs of Harald Fairhair, the grandsons of the king who had made Norway, and they demanded that men choose sides. Hakon fought back. He was a skilled warrior himself, and he had the advantage of defending his own territory against invaders who had to sail across open sea to reach him. For years, the struggle went back and forth, neither side able to land a decisive blow. And then, around the year 961, the final confrontation came. The battle was fought at a place called Fitjar, on the island of Stord, off the southwestern coast of Norway. The sons of Eric had gathered their largest force yet, perhaps as many as 9 ships filled with warriors. Hakon met them with a smaller fleet, but on ground he knew well, in waters where the tides and currents favored the defender. The fighting was brutal. The sagas describe hand-to-hand combat in the shallows, men wading through bloody water to reach their enemies, shields splintering and swords ringing in the cold northern air. Hakon won. The sons of Eric were driven back to their ships, their forces scattered, their invasion broken. But in the moment of victory, something happened that would change everything. An arrow flew, or perhaps a spear, the sources disagree, and Hakon the Good took a wound that would not heal. The saga account of Hakon's death is one of the great set pieces of Old Norse literature. He was carried from the battlefield to a sheltered spot, and there, surrounded by his loyal men, he realized that he was dying. He had been a Christian, raised in England at the court of Athelstan, baptized in the faith that was slowly spreading across the north. But Norway was still largely pagan, and Hakon had compromised with his people's beliefs, tolerating the old sacrifices, never pushing too hard for conversion. Now, at the end, his men asked him what he wanted. Did he wish to be buried according to Christian rites, in consecrated ground with prayers for his soul? Or did he wish to be sent to the old gods, laid in a mound with his weapons and his ships, given to Odin as his father and brothers had been given? Hakon's answer, as the saga records it, was this. He said he had lived among heathens, and so let him be laid among them. He would be buried in the old way, in a mound, like the kings before him. Whether this means he abandoned his Christianity at the end, or whether he simply wanted to honor the customs of his people, or whether the whole scene is a later invention designed to make a point about the persistence of paganism, is impossible to know. What is certain is that Hakon died, and that with his death the throne of Norway lay open once more. The sons of Eric had not won the battle, but they had won the war. What followed was an era of extraordinary violence and confusion, even by the standards of the Viking Age. The eldest surviving son, Harald, claimed the throne. He is known to history as Harald Greycloak, or Harald Grafell in Norwegian, a nickname that refers either to the gray fur cloaks he favored, or, according to some sources, to a period of famine when gray cloaks were all anyone could afford. His reign would be remembered as a time of hardship and oppression, though how much of that reputation is deserved and how much was the product of hostile later sources is difficult to say. Harald ruled with his brothers beside him, a joint kingship of sorts, though he was clearly the dominant figure. And behind them all stood Gunhild, the mother queen, the woman the sagas call Konungamodir, mother of kings. She was perhaps 50 years old by now, maybe older. She had seen her husband killed, her family driven into exile, her sons grow into warriors. She had waited a decade and more for this moment, and now, with her son on the throne of Norway, she intended to enjoy her triumph. The sagas are not kind to Gunhild in power. They describe her as cruel, manipulative, and vindictive. They say she used sorcery to harm her enemies. They accuse her of arranging the murders of men who had opposed her husband, of pursuing old grievances with implacable fury, of driving the kingdom into misery with her greed and her malice. How much of this is true, and how much is the standard treatment given to powerful women by male chroniclers writing centuries later is impossible to determine. What is certain is that she was a central figure in the regime, that she wielded real power, and that she was feared. Harold Greycloak's reign lasted perhaps 8 or 9 years. During that time, he attempted to consolidate his power by eliminating rival claimants, confiscating the property of opponents, and strengthening the authority of the crown at the expense of the traditional rights of the nobles. He also made a fateful decision that would have enormous consequences for the religious history of Norway. He attempted to suppress the old pagan religion by force. The sources describe him destroying temples, burning sacred groves, breaking up the great sacrificial feasts that had been held since time immemorial. Whether he did this out of genuine Christian conviction or because the temples and their priests represented centers of power that rivaled his own is unclear. What is clear is that it made him enemies. The Norwegian nobles, many of whom were still pagan or only nominally Christian, saw Harald's religious policies as yet another assault on their traditional freedoms. They began to look for alternatives. They found one in Denmark. The Danish king at this time was Harald Bluetooth, one of the most remarkable rulers of the Viking Age. He had united Denmark under his sole rule, converted to Christianity, and begun the process of transforming the loose collection of Danish territories into something like a medieval kingdom. He was ambitious, intelligent, and always looking for opportunities to extend his influence into the affairs of his neighbors. The discontented Norwegian nobles offered him exactly such an opportunity. The conspiracy was intricate and ruthless. Harald Bluetooth cultivated Harold Greycloak, drawing him into an alliance, inviting him to Denmark under the pretense of friendship. At some point around 970, Harold Greycloak accepted an invitation to meet the Danish king, perhaps to discuss a joint military campaign, perhaps to negotiate a marriage alliance. He sailed south with a small retinue, trusting in the laws of hospitality that governed relations between kings. He was betrayed. The sources disagree on the exact circumstances, but Harold Greycloak was killed, probably by men acting on the orders of Harold Bluetooth or his allies. One saga places his death in a naval ambush near the island of Hals, at the entrance to the Limfjord. Another suggests he was killed on land, perhaps at a feast. What is certain is that the son of Eric Bloodaxe, the king who had finally reclaimed his father's throne, died as his father had died, betrayed, ambushed, cut down far from home. Gunhild survived. She always survived. With her son dead and her position in Norway untenable, she fled once more into exile. Some sources say she went to Orkney, that familiar refuge. Others suggest she made her way to Denmark, seeking shelter with the same Harold Bluetooth whose treachery had killed her son, a bitter choice if true, but perhaps the only one available. A late and dubious tradition says she ended her days in Denmark, drowned in a bog on the orders of Harold Bluetooth, the traditional fate of witches and sorceresses in Germanic custom. Whether this happened, or whether it is simply a fitting end invented by later writers who believed she deserved no better, is impossible to say. What became of her other sons is equally obscure. Some appear to have died in the wars for Norway. Others may have settled in the Western Isles or in Denmark. The family that had once ruled 2 kingdoms scattered to the winds, their great ambition broken, their legacy a trail of blood and failure, stretching from the fjords of Norway to the moors of England. And yet, the story did not quite end there, because Gunhild's sons, before they fell, had sons of their own. And in the way of Viking politics, the memory of grievance passed from generation to generation, shaping alliances and enmities for decades to come. The descendants of Eric Bloodaxe would continue to appear in the margins of Norwegian history, making claims, raising rebellions, reminding everyone that the blood of Harold Fairhair still ran in their veins. The final extinction of the line, if it ever truly came, is lost in the obscurity of the sources. What we can say is this: the family of Eric Bloodaxe represents something larger than their individual fates. They were the last champions of a particular vision of kingship, one based on warrior prowess, personal loyalty, and the right of the strong to rule. They fought against the emerging order of Christian kingdoms, of stable succession, of law and administration. And they lost. Not because they were weak or cowardly or incompetent, but because the world was changing around them, because the old ways were giving way to new ones, because the age of the Vikings was drawing to its close. To understand what replaced them and why the world changed as it did, we need to look beyond the saga of Eric and his sons to the broader transformation that was reshaping Northern Europe in the 10th and 11th centuries. The Viking Age, conventionally dated from the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 to the death of Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge in 1066, was not a single unified phenomenon, but a series of related movements, a great explosion of energy from the Scandinavian world that touched every corner of Europe and beyond. The causes of this explosion have been debated by historians for generations. Overpopulation in the Scandinavian homelands, improvements in ship technology that made long-distance raiding possible, political fragmentation that created opportunities for ambitious men, climate changes that made agriculture more productive and populations larger. Probably all of these factors played a role in different combinations in different places. What is clear is that the Vikings were not merely raiders and destroyers. They were also traders, settlers, explorers, and state builders. They established colonies in Iceland and Greenland. They reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus. They founded trading cities from Dublin to Kiev. They provided the Byzantine emperors with their most feared soldiers, the Varangian Guard. They ruled kingdoms in England, Ireland, France, and Russia. Their influence stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean, from Newfoundland to Constantinople. But by the mid-10th century, the age of expansion was giving way to an age of consolidation. The great raids had largely ended. The Scandinavian homelands were coalescing into recognizable kingdoms. Christianity was spreading, bringing with it new ideas about law, kingship, and the organization of society. The Vikings were not disappearing, exactly, but they were being transformed, absorbed into the broader patterns of medieval European civilization. Eric Bloodaxe stood at the fulcrum of this transformation. He was born into the old world, the world of warrior kings and blood feuds and pagan gods. He died in the midst of the new world being built, a world of Christian monarchs and written laws and stable borders. He could not adapt. Perhaps no one raised as he was could have adapted, and so he became an anachronism, a relic of a vanishing age, more useful to poets than to historians. The kingdom he briefly ruled in York did not survive him. Within months of his death at Stainmore, the English king Edred had reasserted control over Northumbria. The great Viking city of Jorvik, which had flourished for nearly a century under Norse rule, became simply York, an English city, its Scandinavian character gradually fading into the background of its identity. The last echoes of the Danelaw, the region of eastern England that had been settled by Danes in the 9th century, were absorbed into the unified English kingdom that would eventually become one of the most powerful states in medieval Europe. This process was not smooth or inevitable. There would be more Viking invasions in the decades to come. The great Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard would conquer all of England in 1013. His son Cnut would rule an empire stretching from the Irish Sea to the Baltic. As late as 1066, a Norwegian king would land in Yorkshire with a massive fleet, seeking to revive the old claims of the Norse to the English north. But these later invasions were different in character. They were the campaigns of organized Christian kingdoms, not the freebooting raids of pagan warlords. They sought to conquer and rule, not merely to plunder and withdraw. The old Viking age, the age of Ragnar Lothbrok and Ivar the Boneless and Eric Bloodaxe, was truly over. What replaced it was the medieval order that would shape European civilization for the next 5 centuries. Kingdoms with defined borders and stable successions, churches with their priests and bishops and monasteries, laws written down and enforced by royal authority, an economy based on agriculture and trade rather than plunder, a society organized into estates and orders, each with its proper place and function. This was the world that Eric's enemies were building, the world that would eventually produce the castles and cathedrals and universities of high medieval Europe. It is tempting, from our vantage point 1,000 years later, to see this transformation as progress, as the triumph of civilization over barbarism, order over chaos, light over darkness. And in many ways it was. The violence of the Viking Age was real and terrible. The monasteries burned, the monks slaughtered, the captives sold into slavery, the farms pillaged and destroyed. The medieval order that replaced it, for all its flaws, offered more security to more people, more stability, more opportunities for the ordinary business of human life. But something was also lost. The old Scandinavian societies, for all their violence, had possessed their own distinctive virtues, a fierce independence, a suspicion of centralized power, a legal system that in some ways was more egalitarian than what replaced it, a religion that, whatever else might be said of it, did not claim universal truth or seek to convert the world by force. The voices of the skalds, the poets who preserved the old stories and composed the great memorial poems like the Eriksmal, fell gradually silent. The gods retreated into literature, then into folklore, then into near oblivion, preserved only in the manuscripts of medieval Icelandic scholars who thought the old stories worth saving even if they no longer believed them. Eric Bloodaxe, in his way, was a defender of this older world. Not consciously, perhaps, not ideologically. He was not fighting for a cause or a principle. He was fighting for himself, for his family, for his honor and his power. But in doing so, he stood against the forces that were reshaping Northern Europe, and when he fell, something fell with him. This is not to romanticize him. He was, by any reasonable standard, a brutal man who lived a brutal life. He killed his brothers. He ruled through terror. He died as he lived, by violence, in a quarrel over power and wealth. The medieval chroniclers who wrote about him did not admire him, and there is no reason we should either. But we can recognize, perhaps, that he represented something real, a whole way of being in the world that was passing from existence. And we can acknowledge that the passing of such things is always, in some measure, a loss, even when it is also a gain. The sources that preserve Eric's memory are themselves products of the transition he lived through. The sagas that tell his story were written down in Iceland 2 or 3 centuries after his death by Christian scholars working in a fully medieval literary culture. They drew on older oral traditions, on poems and stories that had been passed down through generations of storytellers, but they shaped this material according to their own interests and assumptions. What we have is not the voice of the Viking Age itself, but an echo of that voice, filtered through the sensibilities of a later time. This filtering process has had profound effects on how we understand Eric and his world. The sagas are not neutral records of fact. They are literary compositions with their own agendas, their own prejudices, their own ideas about what makes a story worth telling. They emphasize certain things and ignore others. They reshape events to fit familiar patterns. They attribute motives that may or may not reflect what the historical actors actually thought and felt. The Gunhild we meet in the sagas, for instance, is almost certainly not the historical Gunhild. She is a literary type, the wicked queen, the sorceress, the power behind the throne. Similar figures appear in stories from cultures around the world, women who wield power through manipulation and magic rather than through force of arms. The sagas needed such a character to explain how a king like Harald Greycloak could have ruled so badly, and Gunhild fit the role. Whether she actually practiced sorcery, whether she actually controlled her sons, whether she actually deserved the vilification heaped upon her by later writers, we cannot know. Similarly, the Eric of the sagas is a literary construction as much as a historical figure. He is the failed king, the exile, the brother killer. He exists in the sagas partly as a contrast to his more successful rivals, a negative example that makes them look better by comparison. His story is shaped to illustrate certain themes that mattered to the saga writers: the dangers of tyranny, the importance of consent in kingship, the consequences of violating the bonds of kinship. These themes may have had some connection to the historical Eric, or they may have been imposed on him by later tradition. What we can say with some confidence is that Eric was real, that he ruled Norway and York, that he died at Stainmore, and that his family continued to trouble Norwegian politics for generations after his death. Beyond these bare facts, almost everything is uncertain. The chronology is disputed. The motivations are obscure. The relationships between the various sources are tangled and contradictory. And yet this uncertainty is itself part of the story. Eric lived at the edge of history, at the boundary between the literate and the pre-literate, between the recorded and the forgotten. A generation earlier, and he would have left no trace at all, merely another Viking warlord whose name was never written down. A generation later, and we might have chronicles and charters and administrative records that would let us reconstruct his reign in detail. As it is, he exists in a twilight zone, half visible, half obscured, known but not knowable. This quality makes him oddly representative of the age he lived in. The Viking Age as a whole has this character of partial visibility, of tantalizing glimpses and frustrating gaps. We know enough to be fascinated, not enough to be satisfied. The sources tell us stories, but they do not tell us the whole story. The archaeology shows us artifacts, but it does not show us the people who made and used them. The place names and loanwords embedded in modern languages hint at Scandinavian presence, but they do not explain what that presence meant. Eric Bloodaxe, standing in the rain on a Pennine moor, surrounded by enemies, fighting his last fight, is a kind of symbol for this entire era. We can see him clearly enough to know he was there. We cannot see him clearly enough to know who he really was. He remains, after all the centuries, still enigmatic, still distant, still partially shrouded in the mists that blow across Stainmore on gray northern days. The mountain pass where he died has changed and not changed over the intervening millennium. The basic geography remains. The high ground of the Pennines, the road crossing from east to west, the exposed moorland where weather can turn deadly without warning. The heather still grows, the curlews still call, the wind still moves across the open ground, as it did when Eric's blood soaked into the peat. But the human landscape has transformed utterly. The road is now the A66, a modern highway with heavy trucks grinding up the gradients. There are no more ambushes of kings. There are service stations and laybys and mobile phone signals. The sheep that graze the hillsides are descendants of breeds developed long after Eric's time. The walls that cross the landscape are products of 18th century enclosure, not medieval agriculture. The villages that dot the valleys have names that Eric might have recognized, but everything else about them would be foreign to him. And yet, stand on the moor on a dark day when the clouds are low and the rain is driving horizontal. Stand there when the light is failing and the road is empty and the only sound is the wind. Stand there and try to imagine what it was like 1,000 years ago when a king made his last stand against men who had betrayed him. The land remembers nothing. It cannot tell us what happened. It cannot confirm or deny the stories we have inherited. It simply exists, indifferent to the dramas that have played out on its surface, unconcerned with the people who have lived and died and been forgotten in its shadow. But we remember. That is our particular burden and our particular gift, we who came after. We remember the names and the stories, the kings and the battles, the poems and the betrayals. We remember imperfectly, inaccurately, with all the distortions that time and distance impose. But we remember. And somewhere in that remembering, Eric Bloodaxe still lives. The memory of Eric Bloodaxe did not rest quietly in the years after Stainmore. It fractured, dispersed, and reassembled itself in different forms across the North Sea world, carried by poets and saga-tellers and the sons who bore his blood and his grudges into the next generation. To understand what Eric meant, both to his contemporaries and to the centuries that followed, we must trace these threads of memory and consequence, following them from the windswept English moorland, where he fell to the fjords and royal halls of Norway, to the skaldic verses that preserved his name in amber, and finally to the long, slow transformation of the Viking world from which he had emerged. Gunhild did not wait long to begin her return. The sources tell us she fled York with her surviving sons, crossing the gray waters of the North Sea to seek refuge first in Orkney, then in Denmark. where her possible kinship with the Danish royal house may have offered protection. She was no longer young, but she was still formidable, and she had something more valuable than youth: sons. Eric had given her many children, and the boys who survived the flight from England were raised in exile with a single burning purpose. They would return to Norway. They would take back what had been stolen from their father. They would avenge the insults and the betrayals, and they would make their enemies remember the name Bloodaxe. The sons of Eric and Gunhild are known collectively in the sagas as the Eriksinir, and their story is one of relentless, bloody-minded persistence. The eldest and most prominent was Harald Greycloak, so named, according to tradition, because of a valuable gray fur cloak he received as a gift from King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark. With Danish support and their own considerable talents for war and intrigue, the Eriksinir launched a campaign of reconquest that would consume Norwegian politics for nearly 2 decades. Their enemy was Håkon the Good, the same half-brother whose return from England had driven Eric into exile in the first place. Håkon had ruled Norway for more than 20 years by the time of Eric's death at Steinmoor, and his reign had been, by the standards of the age, remarkably successful. He was remembered as a just king, a reformer who attempted to introduce Christianity to Norway and who gave his subjects something approaching legal protections against royal overreach. The contrast with Eric could not have been sharper. Where Eric had ruled through fear and force, Håkon had cultivated consent. Where Eric had killed his brothers, Håkon had tried to accommodate his rivals. Where Eric had been driven out by his own people, Håkon was genuinely beloved. But Håkon's virtues did not protect him from the sons of the man he had displaced. Beginning around 955, just a year after Steinmoor, the Eriksinir began raiding the Norwegian coast, testing defenses, gathering intelligence, building alliances among the nobles who had grown tired of Håkon's rule or who hoped to profit from a change in regime. The raids grew in frequency and intensity. Håkon fought them off again and again, winning battles and driving his nephews back to sea, but he could not destroy them. They always returned. They always had more ships, more men, more gold supplied by their Danish patrons. The final confrontation came around 961 at a battle fought on the island of Stord in western Norway. The sources disagree about the details, but the outcome is clear. Håkon won the battle, driving the Eriksinir from the field yet again. But in the fighting, he took a wound, an arrow through the arm that seemed at first to be minor, but soon festered and worsened. Håkon the Good died of his wounds shortly after his victory, the last of Harald Fairhair's sons to rule Norway. He was buried in a mound in the old pagan fashion, though he had spent his life trying to bring the Christian faith to his people. His death left Norway without a king and the Eriksinir without an enemy. Harald Greycloak and his brothers descended on Norway like wolves on an unguarded flock. They seized the throne, divided the kingdom among themselves, and began a reign that would be remembered, even in the violent annals of the Viking Age, as particularly brutal. The sagas paint Harald Greycloak as a capable warrior, but a poor ruler, more interested in raiding and plundering than in the slow work of governance. His mother, Gunhild, the widow of Eric Bloodaxe, was the real power behind the throne. She had survived exile and widowhood and the long years of waiting, and now she had what she had always wanted, her sons on the throne of Norway, her enemies dead or scattered, her position restored. The sagas call her Mother of Kings, and they do not mean it as a compliment. To the later Norse tradition, she was a symbol of everything dangerous and destabilizing about female power, a witch who had used sorcery to advance her sons and destroy her rivals. The reign of the Eriksinir was short and chaotic. Harald Greycloak ruled for perhaps 8 years, during which time he managed to alienate virtually every powerful faction in Norway. He confiscated estates, broke oaths, killed rivals, and interfered with the ancient religious traditions of the Norwegian aristocracy. He attempted to complete his uncle Håkon's project of Christianization, but with none of Håkon's diplomatic skill. Where Håkon had asked and suggested, Harald demanded and punished. The result was widespread resentment that soon coalesced into active rebellion. The end came around 970, when Harald Greycloak fell into a trap laid by his former ally, the Danish king Harald Bluetooth, and the powerful Norwegian chieftain Håkon Sigurdsson, known to history as Håkon Jarl. The details are murky, involving a carefully orchestrated ambush in the waters of the Limfjord, but the outcome was certain. Harald Greycloak was killed, and with him died the political hopes of the Eiriksenir. Some of his brothers survived and continued to make trouble for years afterward, but they never again came close to the Norwegian throne. Gunhild, the mother of kings, disappears from the reliable sources around this time. The sagas offer various accounts of her end, some claiming she was drowned in a bog by the order of Harald Bluetooth, others suggesting she lived out her days in obscurity. We do not know. Like so much else about this era, her fate remains hidden in the mists. What followed the fall of the Eiriksenir was a new phase in Norwegian history, the rise of Håkon Jarl, and eventually the great unifying king Olaf Tryggvason, who would complete the Christianization of Norway by methods even more ruthless than anything Erik Bloodaxe had employed. But that is another story. For our purposes, what matters is the legacy, the long shadow that Erik and Gunhild and their sons cast across the Norwegian consciousness for centuries to come. The memory of Erik Bloodaxe was preserved most powerfully not in chronicles or histories, but in poetry. The Norse world of the 10th century was still overwhelmingly oral in its cultural transmission, and the most important repository of cultural memory was the skaldic tradition, the art of the court poet who composed intricate, elusive, technically demanding verses in honor of his patron. These poems were not merely entertainment. They were records, testimonies, arguments about meaning and value that were meant to endure long after the events they described had passed from living memory. Two great poems survive that deal with Erik Bloodaxe, and together they represent something remarkable, the final flowering of pagan Norse religious poetry, composed at the very moment when the old beliefs were beginning their long retreat before the advance of Christianity. The first and most famous is the Eriksmal, the words of Erik, composed shortly after his death at Steinmoor, probably commissioned by Gunhild herself as a memorial to her fallen husband. The poem is fragmentary, only about 25 stanzas surviving out of what was probably a much longer work, but what remains is extraordinary. It imagines Erik's arrival in Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where he is greeted by Odin, the All-Father, the god of war and wisdom and poetry and death. The poem begins with a question. What is that sound, like thousands of men marching, making the benches creak and the hall shake? Odin answers that it is Erik Bloodaxe, coming with a great company of warriors. He orders the heroes Sigmund and Sinfjotli, legendary figures from the mythological past, to rise and greet the newcomer, for a king is coming whom they should be glad to receive. The poem then shifts to a dialogue between the god and the dead king. Odin asks why he summoned Erik from the world of the living, when Erik was so great a warrior, so worthy a king. Erik replies that he did not know, but that he had reddened his blade in many lands and fought many battles. Odin's answer is the theological heart of the poem, because the future is uncertain. The gray wolf watches the dwellings of the gods. The implication is clear. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the final battle in which the old powers of the north will fall, is coming. Odin is gathering the greatest warriors of the age to fight beside him on that final day. Erik is not merely being honored, he is being recruited. This vision of the afterlife, of Valhalla as a preparation for apocalyptic war, rather than simply a reward for bravery, represents some of the deepest thinking in Norse pagan theology. The Eriksmal shows us a religious culture that was sophisticated, nuanced, and deeply concerned with questions of meaning and destiny. It shows us a worldview in which even the gods were mortal, in which the forces of chaos and destruction would ultimately triumph, and in which the only appropriate response was courage in the face of inevitable defeat. Erik, the failed king, the brother killer, the exile who died in the rain on a foreign hillside, is transformed in the poem into something grander and more terrible. A hero whose life and death had cosmic significance, whose sword arm was needed by the gods themselves. The second great poem about Erik is the Håkonarmal, the words of Håkon, composed in honor of his half-brother and rival Håkon the Good after his death at the Battle of Stord. At first, this might seem irrelevant to Eric's story, but in fact the two poems are closely connected, probably composed by the same poet, Eyvinder Finsen, known as the plagiarist, and clearly intended to be read together as companion pieces. The Hakonarmal also depicts its subject arriving in Valhalla, but the tone is subtly different. Hakon was Christian, or at least Christian educated, and the poem acknowledges this complexity, showing him welcomed by the pagan gods even though he had worshipped a different deity during his life. The poem praises Hakon for his justice and his protection of the old sanctuaries, implicitly contrasting him with the Eirikssyner, who would later desecrate those same holy places. Read together, the Eiriksmal and the Hakonarmal represent a kind of theological debate conducted in verse, an argument about what constitutes a good king, a worthy life, a proper death. Eric is celebrated for his martial prowess, his ruthlessness, his unstoppable force. Hakon is celebrated for his justice, his piety, his restraint. Both are welcomed into Valhalla, but the welcome carries different implications. The gods need warriors like Eric, but they also need kings like Hakon. The poems do not resolve the tension between these two models of kingship. They present them both, leaving the listener to draw their own conclusions. What strikes the modern reader most forcefully about these poems is their confidence, their complete assurance that the pagan cosmos they describe was real and meaningful. There is no defensiveness, no sense of a tradition under siege. And yet, within a generation of their composition, the religious world they celebrated would be swept away. Olaf Tryggvason would forcibly baptize the Norwegian nobility at sword point. Churches would rise on the sites of old temples. The names of Odin and Thor and Freya would pass from active worship into folklore and literary convention. The Eiriksmal and the Hakonarmal are among the last genuine expressions of Norse paganism as a living faith, composed at the very moment when that faith was beginning its long decline into memory. This religious transformation is essential context for understanding Eric Bloodaxe and his legacy. Eric lived at the turning of an age, and his life embodied the tensions and contradictions of that transition. He was raised in the old religion, surrounded by the rituals and beliefs of his ancestors, trained in the warrior code that valued courage above all other virtues. But he also lived in a world where Christianity was advancing rapidly, where his own half-brother had been educated at the court of a Christian king, where the political advantages of conversion were becoming increasingly clear. The saga accounts suggest that Eric was baptized at some point during his time in England, though they also indicate that this conversion was nominal at best, a political expedient rather than a genuine change of heart. His court in York was probably a hybrid space, where Christian priests and pagan skalds coexisted in uneasy proximity, where Mass was said and sacrifices were offered, where the old ways and the new ways had not yet fully separated into irreconcilable opposites. The world that produced Eric Bloodaxe was, in retrospect, a world in its final generations. The great age of Viking expansion, which had begun in the late 8th century with the raid on Lindisfarne and the sudden eruption of Scandinavian warriors onto the European stage, was drawing to its close. The causes of this ending were multiple and complex. The Scandinavian homelands were becoming increasingly integrated into European Christian civilization, their kings adopting the religion and administrative practices of their neighbors. The easy targets of earlier centuries, the undefended monasteries and poorly organized kingdoms, had learned to defend themselves or had already been conquered and absorbed. The climate was changing. The medieval warm period that had made Greenland habitable and Iceland prosperous was giving way to cooler conditions that would eventually make North Atlantic settlement more difficult. The very success of the Viking expansion had created a diaspora so extensive that the distinctiveness of Scandinavian identity was being diluted by intermarriage and cultural assimilation. Eric himself exemplified these trends. His wife was Danish, or perhaps Finnish, depending on which source you believe. His court in York was multilingual, including English and Norse and probably Irish and Frankish speakers. His sons would fight their wars with Danish support. His enemies in Norway would ally with German emperors and Polish dukes. The tight insular world of the early Viking age, where a handful of petty kingdoms around the Scandinavian coasts produced raiding parties that seemed to appear from nowhere, had given way to a far more interconnected political landscape in which Norse rulers were players in a European game, subject to European rules and European expectations. The Kingdom of York that Eric briefly ruled was itself a product of this complex hybrid world. The city had been a Viking capital since the great heathen army captured it in 866, but nearly a century of Norse rule had transformed it into something that was neither purely Scandinavian nor purely English. The material culture of 10th century York, as revealed by archaeological excavations at sites like Coppergate, shows a cosmopolitan trading center where craftsworkers used techniques from across the known world. Amber from the Baltic was carved alongside jet from Whitby. Silk from Byzantium was worn alongside locally woven wool. Coins minted in York circulated from Dublin to Kiev. The people who walked the muddy streets of Jorvik spoke multiple languages, worshipped multiple gods, and conducted business with partners across thousands of miles of sea and land routes. This was the world Eric inherited when the Northumbrians invited him to be their king. It was not a simple matter of Viking conquest or ethnic solidarity. The Northumbrian elite who summoned Eric were themselves a mixed population, some descended from the original Danish settlers, others from the Anglian nobility who had accommodated themselves to Norse rule. They wanted a king who could defend them against southern English aggression, but they also wanted a king who understood the complex political landscape of the North Sea world, who had connections and influence beyond Northumbria itself. Eric, with his Norwegian royal blood, his Danish wife, his experience of courts from Norway to England, his reputation as a warrior and leader, must have seemed ideal for their purposes. What they got was more complicated. Eric was a warrior king in an age that was beginning to demand something different from its rulers. The administrative sophistication of the West Saxon monarchy, with its written laws and its network of royal officials and its systematic approach to taxation and military organization, represented a new model of kingship that was spreading across Europe. Eric, shaped by the older tradition of personal war leadership and face-to-face loyalty, may have struggled to adapt to these demands. The sources suggest that he was an effective military leader, but a poor politician, better at leading raids than at managing the delicate coalition of interests that held his kingdom together. The nobles who eventually betrayed him at Stainmore may have concluded that Eric was simply not worth the trouble he attracted. His presence on the throne of York invited constant interference from the southern English kings, who regarded Northumbria as rightfully part of their realm. His Norwegian feuds brought complications and enemies from across the sea. His religious ambiguity satisfied neither the Christians nor the pagans in his kingdom. His wife, with her reputation for sorcery and scheming, alarmed the local aristocracy. Whatever combination of factors led to the final decision, the Northumbrian elite concluded that their survival lay in accommodation with the South rather than continued resistance under a foreign king. The betrayal at Stainmore was not unique in this period. The late Viking Age was full of such moments, of oaths broken and kings abandoned, of pragmatic calculations that overrode traditional loyalties. The old warrior code, with its emphasis on personal loyalty unto death, was being eroded by new political realities that made such loyalty seem foolish or self-destructive. The men who turned against Eric may have told themselves they were being realistic, that they were saving their families and their estates from destruction, that Eric would have done the same in their position. Perhaps they were right. The sources do not tell us what they thought or felt, only what they did. Eric died fighting, which was probably the only way he knew how to die. The Eiríksmal imagines him arriving in Valhalla with a great company of warriors, which suggests he did not die alone, that his retainers and companions fell beside him. The poem mentions his son Herrick among the slain. Others of his household must have stood with him to the end, honoring in their deaths the old code that the new world was forgetting. They did not save him, but they joined him, and in the logic of the pagan afterlife, that was enough. They would feast together in Odin's hall and prepare together for the final battle. The site of Eric's death was remembered, even if the details grew hazy over time. Medieval tradition placed the battle at a location called Ray Cross, where an ancient boundary marker stood at the highest point of the Stainmore Pass. A stone monument, since lost, supposedly commemorated the site where Eric fell. Later, antiquarians identified various locations in the area with the events of 954, though none of these identifications can be verified. What is certain is that the general area, the high moorland of Stainmore, where the road from York crossed into Cumbria, remained associated with Eric's death for centuries afterward. Even today, local historians and enthusiasts debate the precise location of the battle, examining the topography for evidence of where an ambush might have been laid, where a small company of warriors might have made a stand, where a king might have died. The landscape offers no answers. The moors are indifferent to human questions. The peat that covers them has swallowed countless secrets over the millennia, and it does not give them up easily. Occasionally, dramatically, the past emerges, a preserved body, a cache of artifacts, a wooden trackway laid down by forgotten hands. But Eric has left no such traces. His bones, wherever they lie, have returned to the earth that covered them. His weapons and armor, if they were not looted from his corpse, have rusted into nothing. His blood soaked into the peat and became one with the landscape. Nothing remains except the stories. And yet the stories are not nothing. They have carried Eric's name across more than 1,000 years, keeping him present in human memory when everything physical about him has disappeared. The Eiriksmal still exists, still speaks of his arrival in Valhalla, still preserves the theological vision that his death inspired. The sagas still tell of his battles and his brothers and his terrible queen. The histories still record his reign in York, his expulsion, his return, his fall. The name Bloodaxe still carries its weight of violence and mortality, still evokes images of a man who lived by the sword and died by the sword in an age when such a life was both possible and meaningful. This is the strange immortality of the historical figure, to be remembered not as one was, but as one seemed, to be preserved not in flesh, but in narrative, to become a story that later generations tell themselves for reasons that would be incomprehensible to the person who inspired it. Eric cannot speak to us directly. He left no writings, no personal testimony, no unmediated record of his thoughts or feelings. Everything we know about him comes through intermediaries, through poets and chroniclers and saga-tellers who had their own purposes and their own perspectives. The Eric we encounter in the sources is already a construction, already shaped by the needs and assumptions of the people who recorded his life. This does not mean he is fictional. There really was a man named Eric, son of Harold Fairhair, who really did rule Norway briefly and York twice, who really did die at Stainmore in circumstances that involved betrayal and violence. The archaeological and numismatic evidence confirms the broad outlines of the story. Coins minted in Eric's name have been found. The political geography of 10th century England makes sense of his career. The Norwegian genealogies, cross-checked against independent sources, confirm his place in the royal succession. Eric existed. The question is not whether he was real, but what his reality means, how we should interpret the fragmentary evidence we possess, what conclusions we can draw about a man who lived and died so long ago in a world so different from our own. The answer, perhaps the only honest answer, is that Eric's meaning shifts depending on who is asking and when. To his contemporaries in Norway, he was a failed king, a brother killer who could not hold what his father had built, driven out by a younger sibling who offered everything Eric could not: restraint, accommodation, a willingness to share power rather than seize it. To the Northumbrians who invited him to York, he was something else entirely. A proven warrior of impeccable royal lineage who could give their nascent independence the legitimacy it craved, who could make their northern kingdom seem like more than a rebellious province, who could transform their resistance to southern English rule into the continuation of a dynasty that stretched back to the legendary unifier of Norway. To the poets who composed the Eiriksmal, he was raw material for theological statement, a vehicle through which the old pagan vision of death and glory could be articulated one final time before Christianity swept it away. To the saga writers of later centuries, he was a character in a larger narrative about the making of Norway, a cautionary example of kingship without wisdom, necessary to the story precisely because he failed where others succeeded. and to us, standing at the far end of a millennium, looking back through layers of interpretation and reinterpretation, through nationalist appropriations and scholarly revisions, through Viking reenactments and popular culture references, through video games and television series and novels that have taken the raw material of the sagas and transformed it into entertainment? What is Eric Bloodaxe to us? He is perhaps a window onto the strangeness of the past, not the comfortable strangeness of costume and custom, of longships and mead halls and runic inscriptions, but the deeper strangeness of a moral universe that operated by different rules than our own. Eric lived in a world where killing one's brothers was not merely possible, but, under certain circumstances, expected. The logic of succession in early medieval Scandinavia made fratricide almost inevitable. A king with many sons was bequeathing to those sons not a stable inheritance, but a problem to be solved by elimination. The strongest would rule. The rest would die or submit or flee. This was not considered monstrous. It was considered natural, the way power worked, the way it had always worked and would always work. The nickname Bloodaxe, whatever its precise origin, would have carried no special opprobrium in 10th century Norway. Every axe was a blood axe. Every king was a killer. Eric was simply more thorough than most. This is difficult for modern observers to process. We want our historical figures to be either heroes we can admire or villains we can condemn, characters in a moral drama whose outcome we have already determined. Eric resists both categorizations. He was neither exceptionally cruel nor exceptionally merciful by the standards of his time. He was a king doing what kings did, using the tools available to him, responding to threats and opportunities according to the logic of his culture. That his methods seem brutal to us says more about the distance we have traveled than about any particular failing on his part. The Viking Age was not a golden time of noble warriors and honorable combat. It was a period of endemic violence, of slave-taking and raiding and the casual destruction of communities, of children sold into bondage and women carried off as prizes, of monasteries burned not because the Vikings hated Christianity, but because monasteries were where the portable wealth was kept. Eric was a product of this world, shaped by its values, operating within its constraints. To judge him by standards that did not exist in his time is not moral seriousness, but historical illiteracy. And yet we cannot simply refuse to judge. The people Eric killed were still people. The brothers whose deaths cleared his path to power were still sons and fathers and husbands. The communities his raiders devastated were still composed of human beings who loved and feared and hoped. The moral framework of the 10th century may have accommodated Eric's violence, but that accommodation does not make the violence disappear. It merely distributes responsibility differently, spreading it across an entire culture rather than concentrating it in a single individual. Eric wielded the axe, but the world he lived in handed it to him and told him to swing. This is the irreducible difficulty of historical understanding. We must see the past clearly enough to recognize its difference from the present, while still maintaining the moral seriousness that refuses to dissolve human suffering into cultural context. Eric Bloodaxe was a man of his time, and his time was bloody. Both statements are true, neither cancels the other. The sources that preserve Eric's story also preserve, inadvertently, traces of the people his story affected. The Eiríksmal speaks of the warriors who died with him at Stainmore, the men who followed their king into a hopeless battle and fell beside him on the moor. They are named, some of them, Sigurd, Ragnvald, others whose names have been corrupted by transmission or lost entirely. These were real men with real lives, families who mourned them, futures that ended on that autumn day in 954. The poem treats them as honored companions, worthy to enter Valhalla alongside their lord, but their individual stories are subsumed into Eric's story, their deaths meaningful only as extensions of his death. This is how historical memory works. The famous absorb the anonymous, the powerful consume the powerless, and what remains is a story about kings and queens, while the farmers and fishermen and craftspeople who constituted the actual substance of medieval society fade into statistical abstraction. The same process affected Eric's enemies. Håkon, the brother who displaced him, appears in the sources primarily as a foil to Eric, the good king who succeeded where the bad king failed. But Hakon was his own person, with his own complexities and contradictions, his own story that deserves telling on its own terms. He had been sent to England as a boy, raised at the court of King Athelstan, educated in Latin letters and Christian theology. When he returned to Norway to claim the throne, he brought with him foreign ideas about kingship and religion, ideas that the Norwegian aristocracy tolerated because they came packaged with the more palatable offers of lower taxes and greater autonomy. Hakon is remembered as Hakon the Good, partly for his personal qualities and partly because the saga writers who recorded his reign were Christians who approved of his attempts to bring their faith to Norway. But his reign was not untroubled. He faced constant pressure from Eric's surviving sons, who raided the Norwegian coast and challenged his authority. He fought battles and made compromises. He died, according to some sources, from wounds received in combat against his nephews, the children of the brother he had driven out. The cycle of violence that Eric began continued long after his death. And then there was Gunhild. Of all the figures who move through Eric's story, Gunhild is perhaps the most elusive and the most fascinating. The sources cannot agree on who she was or where she came from. Some say Denmark, some say Norway, some say the far north of Finnmark, where Sami shamans taught her the arts of magic. The disagreement itself is significant. Gunhild was a woman who accumulated power in a world where women's power was largely invisible, exercised through influence rather than direct authority, through the management of households and the arrangement of marriages, and the subtle manipulation of male relatives. Such power threatened the chroniclers who recorded it. They could not deny that Gunhild had shaped events, that she had been present at every turning point in Eric's career, that after his death she had continued to direct the fortunes of her sons for decades. But they could not comfortably acknowledge a woman as a political agent in her own right. So they reached for explanations that contained her power within acceptable categories. She was a witch, a sorceress, a practitioner of dark arts that gave her unnatural influence over men. Her wisdom became cunning, her intelligence became manipulation, her survival skills became evidence of supernatural assistance. The historical Gunhild, insofar as we can reconstruct her from the hostile sources that survive, was probably something simpler and more impressive. A clever woman in a difficult situation, doing what she could to protect herself and her children in a world that offered women few protections. She married Eric when she was young, bore him many sons, followed him into exile when his kingdom collapsed, stood beside him through his troubled reign in York, and survived his death to spend the remaining decades of her life working to restore her sons to the throne their father had lost. The saga writers remember her as Eric's evil counselor, the voice in his ear urging him to ever greater cruelties. But the saga writers were not present at Eric's court. They were working centuries later, constructing narratives from fragments and rumors and the political needs of their own time. The Gunhild they created was a literary figure, a type rather than a person, the wicked queen of 1,000 folktales overlaid onto a real woman whose actual characteristics are largely unrecoverable. What we can say with confidence is that Gunhild outlived Eric by many years, that she raised her sons to seek the vengeance their father's death demanded, and that she remained a formidable presence in Norwegian and Danish politics until her own death sometime in the 970s or 980s. One tradition holds that she died in Denmark, drowned in a bog on the orders of King Harald Bluetooth, punished at last for crimes real or imagined. Another tradition says she lived out her days in Orkney, surrounded by grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the matriarch of a dynasty that never quite achieved its ambitions. Like so much about Gunhild, the truth is irrecoverable. She remains what the sources made her, a shadow queen, glimpsed at the edges of men's stories, her own story fragmentary and disputed. The sons of Eric and Gunhild constitute their own chapter in the long narrative of the Viking Age, a chapter that extends the consequences of Eric's life well beyond his death. The sagas name them variously. Gamla, the eldest, who died young in battle. Harald, called Greycloak, who eventually seized the Norwegian throne only to lose it again through the same combination of arrogance and poor judgment that had undone his father. Ragnfrud, Erling, Gudrud, Sigurd Sleva, and others whose names appear and disappear in the sources with frustrating inconsistency. These were Eric's legacy, the biological continuation of his line, the carriers of whatever he hoped to pass on to future generations. Their story is one of persistence against long odds. After Eric's death at Stainmore, Gunhild gathered her brood and fled, first to Orkney, where the Norse jarls offered temporary refuge, then to Denmark, where her own family connections provided a more secure base. From there, the sons launched raid after raid against Norway, keeping the pressure on King Haakon, never allowing him a moment of peace. When Haakon died around 961, they finally achieved what their father had failed to maintain. Harald Greycloak became king of Norway, ruling from the halls that his grandfather Harald Fairhair had built and his father Eric had lost. But Harald Greycloak was too much his father's son. He alienated the same aristocracy that had turned against Eric, demanding too much, sharing too little, mistaking force for authority. Within a decade he was dead, killed in an ambush arranged by his former allies, and the throne of Norway passed to Hakon Sigurdsson, a jarl from Trøndelag, whose family had been enemies of Eric's line for generations. The sons of Eric and Gunhild, who survived Harold's fall, scattered across the Viking world, some to Denmark, some to the Scottish Isles, some to the strange lands of the south, where Viking adventurers were carving out careers as mercenaries in the service of foreign kings. The dream of restoring their father's kingdom faded into a fantasy sustained only by Gunhild, growing old in whatever hall still offered her shelter, still scheming, still hoping, still believing that her blood would one day rule Norway as her husband's father had ruled it. It never did. The line of Harald Fairhair continued through other branches, and in time a different descendant, Olaf Tryggvason, would return to Norway to claim the throne and bring Christianity with him. The sons of Eric Bloodaxe became footnotes to larger stories, their individual fates increasingly difficult to trace through the tangle of sources. Some died in battle, some in bed, some in circumstances that were violent but obscure. By the end of the 10th century, they had passed out of history, their names preserved only in genealogies and the occasional anecdote in longer sagas about more successful kings. And yet there is something in their persistence that commands a certain respect, or at least attention. These were men who had seen their father driven from his kingdom, had watched their mother's political hopes collapse again and again, had known exile and disappointment and the slow erosion of everything they had been raised to expect. They could have accepted defeat. They could have made peace with the new order, settled into the comfortable obscurity of minor nobility, let their father's memory fade into the general background noise of a violent age. Instead, they kept fighting. Generation after generation, they threw themselves against the forces that had displaced them, taking whatever small victories they could, refusing to accept that the story was over. The stubbornness is almost admirable, in a grim way. It is certainly historically significant. The endless warfare waged by Eric's sons weakened every Norwegian king for the rest of the century, creating instability that shaped the country's development for generations. This is one of the peculiarities of the historical process. Failure can be as consequential as success. Eric Bloodaxe failed as a king. He could not hold Norway, could not sustain York, could not build anything that outlasted him, but his failure created ripples that spread outward through time, affecting people who never knew his name, shaping events he could not have imagined. The century after his death was shaped in part by reactions to his legacy, by the determination of his sons to avenge him, and the determination of his enemies to prevent that vengeance. History is not only made by winners. It is made by everyone who participates, and the losers participate no less than the victors, leaving their marks in the spaces between what the winners built. The physical traces of Eric's career are remarkably sparse, considering the drama of the life they represent. In York, where he ruled twice as king, the archaeological record yields coins bearing his name, small silver pennies minted in the style of the period, their inscriptions reading Eric Rex in uneven Latin letters. These coins are among the most tangible connections we have to Eric's actual existence, physical objects that were handled by his contemporaries, that passed from hand to hand in the markets of Jorvik, that carried his authority into the daily transactions of his subjects. They survive in modest numbers, scattered across the collections of museums and private collectors, evidence that for a few years in the middle of the 10th century, a man called Eric held power in northern England and exercised the prerogative of coinage that was the mark of kingship. In Norway, Eric's physical legacy is even thinner. The political chaos of his reign left few monuments, and the Christian kings who followed eventually imposed their own architectural vision on the landscape, building churches and palaces that erased the halls of the pagan past. Harald Fairhair's great estate at Avaldsnes, where Eric presumably spent at least part of his childhood, has been partially excavated, revealing traces of aristocratic occupation from the Viking period, but nothing specifically attributable to Eric has been identified. He passed through the Norwegian landscape like water, leaving no permanent mark. Stainmore, where he died, preserves no verified traces of the battle at all. The ancient marker called Ray Cross still stands, though its connection to Eric's death is uncertain at best and likely the product of later antiquarian imagination. The moor itself is unchanged in its essentials, the same sky, the same wind, the same rough grassland stretching toward distant hills. If you stand there today, as generations of visitors have stood there, you can imagine the scene easily enough. A narrow road winding through the high pass, a small company of warriors, tired and weary, their king among them, the sudden appearance of enemies on the slopes above, the desperate fighting that followed, sword against sword, axe against axe, until the last of Eric's men had fallen and the king himself lay dead on the cold ground. The imagination supplies what the evidence cannot. And yet imagination is not nothing. It is how we bridge the gap between the dry facts of the historical record and the lived reality of human experience, how we make the past present enough to matter. The literary afterlife of Eric Bloodaxe has proven more durable than any physical monument could have been. The Eriksmal, composed shortly after his death, established a template for understanding him that subsequent writers have never entirely abandoned. In the poem, Eric arrives at Valhalla accompanied by 5 kings, his companions in death as they had been in life. Odin himself comes to the door to greet them, asking what thunder he hears approaching, whether the benches are shaking and the beer being prepared, because Eric is coming, Eric the king. The gods welcome him, arm him with sword and mail, and prepare him for his eternal role, to fight alongside them when Ragnarok comes, when the great wolf breaks its chains and the final battle between order and chaos begins. This is not history. It is mythology, the transformation of a political figure into a mythological one, the insertion of a real person into a cosmic narrative that existed before him and would continue after him. And yet there is something in it that captures an essential truth about Eric's world. The men who composed the Eriksmal believed in Valhalla. They believed that death in battle led to a golden hall where warriors feasted with the gods. They believed that the cosmos was structured around a final conflict, that the world would end in fire and ice, that the heroes who had died sword in hand would rise to fight once more. Eric's death at Stainmore was, in this worldview, not a defeat, but a graduation, a passage from the lesser hall of earthly kingship to the greater hall of divine companionship. The poem does not mourn him. It celebrates his arrival in his true home. We cannot share this belief. The afterlife of Valhalla is not available to modern observers, who must see Eric's death as a death, final and absolute, the end of whatever consciousness once inhabited his body. But we can recognize what the belief meant to those who held it, how it shaped their understanding of violence and mortality, how it provided a framework within which men could face death without despair. The Eriksmal is a window into this world, a preserved fragment of a mentality that no longer exists. When we read it, we are not learning about Eric's actual destination after death. We are learning about what his contemporaries hoped death meant, what stories they told themselves to make the inevitable bearable. The world that could believe in Valhalla was already dying when Eric fell at Stainmore. This is perhaps the deepest significance of his life and death, The reason his story continues to resonate 1,000 years after the last breath left his body on that windswept moor. He stood at a hinge point in northern European history, one of the last great figures of the pagan Viking age, and his fall marked not merely the end of a man or a kingdom, but the closing of a chapter in the human relationship with the divine. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity was well underway by the mid-10th century, though its progress was uneven, and its completion would take another century or more. Eric's own half-brother Håkon, the man who drove him from Norway, had been raised as a Christian at the English court and attempted, without success, to impose the new faith on his Norwegian subjects. The resistance he faced was fierce enough that he eventually abandoned the effort and ruled as a nominal pagan, whatever his private beliefs might have been. The tension between the old gods and the new was not yet resolved, and men like Eric embodied that tension in their very persons, products of a culture that still honored Odin and Thor and Freya. Missionaries preached a different kind of salvation in the trading towns and royal courts. What did Eric himself believe? The sources do not tell us. He was never baptized, so far as we know, and he patronized the composition of traditional praise poems that invoked the old gods. Gunhild's reputation as a sorceress suggests that the household maintained connections to pre-Christian spiritual practices. And yet, Eric lived much of his adult life in close proximity to Christian culture, first in the mixed religious environment of Viking York, and later through his dealings with English kings who were devout Christians. He would have been familiar with churches, with priests, with the rituals of baptism and mass and burial in consecrated ground. Whether he found any of it persuasive, whether he ever doubted the gods of his fathers, whether he died believing that Odin was waiting to receive him, or fearing that there was nothing at all beyond the darkness, these questions cannot be answered. They belong to the interior life of a man whose interior life was never recorded. What we can say is that the world moved on without him. Within a generation of his death, Norway would be permanently Christianized under the violent evangelism of Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, saints and kings who burned temples, killed priests of the old gods, and imposed baptism at sword point. Denmark had already converted. Sweden would follow more slowly over the course of the 11th century. By the year 1100, the old religion of the North was effectively dead as a living practice, surviving only in literature, in place names, in folk customs whose original meanings had been forgotten. The Eriksmal itself became a curiosity, a beautiful artifact of a vanished worldview, preserved because it was magnificent poetry rather than because anyone still believed its theology. Eric Bloodaxe thus occupies a peculiar position in historical memory. He is remembered primarily for his death and for the poem that commemorated it, for being the last of something rather than the first. His Norwegian reign was a failure, brief and bloody and ending in exile. His English reign was marginal, a peripheral kingdom far from the centers of power, lasting perhaps 7 years in total and leaving almost no administrative or cultural legacy. He built nothing that endured. He founded no dynasty that survived. He conquered no territories that bore his name. By any conventional measure of royal achievement, he was among the least successful kings of his era. And yet, the name persists. Eric Bloodaxe. 1,000 years later, it still carries its charge of violence and tragedy and dark romance. Schoolchildren who could not name a dozen medieval kings can name him. Popular culture returns to him again and again in novels and films and video games, drawn by the savagery of the epithet and the melodrama of his story. He has become an archetype, the brutal Viking king, the blood-soaked warrior of the pagan North, even though the historical reality was far more complicated and far more human than the archetype allows. Part of this persistence is simply the name itself. Bloodaxe is unforgettable in a way that most historical epithets are not. It lodges in the memory, conjuring images of dripping weapons and dismembered bodies, of a man so violent that his contemporaries had to invent a special name to capture it. The name does work that no amount of historical scholarship can undo. It creates Eric anew in each generation, not as he was, but as the name suggests he might have been. a monster in human form, a creature of pure aggression and brutality. But the persistence is also about something deeper than nomenclature. Eric's story touches on themes that remain perennially compelling: the tragedy of exile, the corrupting nature of power, the betrayal of kinship bonds, the clash of civilizations at moments of historical transition. His life can be read as a meditation on the costs of violence, on what happens to men who live by the sword and cannot escape the logic of their own brutality. He killed his brothers to secure his throne and was killed in turn by men who had sworn him loyalty. He was driven from two kingdoms by the people he ruled, rejected by Norwegians and Englishmen alike, despite his royal blood and martial prowess. His strength was also his weakness, his willingness to use force alienating the very subjects he needed to govern. There is a moral shape to this story that appeals to something deep in human psychology, a sense that violence begets violence, that blood calls for blood, that men who shed kin blood will have their own blood shed in turn. The sagas that tell Eric's story are saturated with this understanding, this conviction, that the cosmos is structured around cycles of vengeance and retribution, that every killing creates a debt that must eventually be paid. When Eric died at Stainmore, betrayed by his own nobles, the saga writers saw not accident, but fate, not political contingency, but cosmic justice. He had lived by betrayal, and he died by betrayal. The pattern closed around him like a trap. We need not share this belief in moral causation to recognize its power as a narrative structure. The human mind seeks patterns, explanations, meanings in the chaos of events, and Eric's story provides them in abundance. His life can be made to mean something, to illustrate a principle, to demonstrate a truth about human nature. This is why we continue to tell it, continue to reshape it for our own purposes, continue to find in it a mirror for our own preoccupations with power and violence and the fragility of political order. Gunhild understood this, perhaps, or at least the saga writers who created her character understood it. After Eric's death, she did not fade quietly into widowhood. She took her sons, the sources name them as Harald Greycloak, Gamli, Guttorm, Sigurd Sleva, and others, and sailed back across the North Sea to wage war against the men who had taken her husband's kingdom. For 20 years, she was the driving force behind a relentless campaign to restore her family's position in Norway, allying with the kings of Denmark, intriguing against the Norwegian nobles, and eventually placing her son Harald Greycloak on the throne as king around 961. The sources paint her in the darkest possible colors. She was a witch, they said, a practitioner of forbidden arts who had learned sorcery in the frozen wastes of Finnmark. She was a manipulator who controlled her sons like puppets, directing their violence and their policies to serve her own insatiable hunger for power. She was cruel, vindictive, and utterly without scruple, willing to use any means to achieve her ends. The Norwegian nobles who had suffered under Eric's rule feared her even more than they had feared him, for she had his ruthlessness without his relative directness. Where Eric killed openly, Gunhild schemed in shadows. How much of this reputation is deserved, and how much is misogynistic fantasy is impossible to determine. Medieval sources consistently demonize powerful women, attributing to them supernatural malevolence and unnatural ambition whenever they exercise political influence. Gunhild may have been no worse than any other royal widow fighting to protect her family's interests in a violent age. Her witchcraft, nothing more than intelligence and determination misread by hostile chroniclers. Or she may have been genuinely formidable, a woman who refused to accept the passive role that her society assigned to widows and mothers, who wielded power openly and suffered the inevitable consequences in her reputation. What is certain is that her son's reign in Norway was troubled and short-lived. Harald Greycloak was killed around 970, betrayed by his own allies and ambushed in much the same manner as his father had been ambushed at Stainmore. The parallels would not have been lost on contemporary observers. The family seemed cursed, doomed to repeat the same pattern of violence and betrayal across generations. Gunhild herself disappears from the sources around this time, her fate unknown. Some later traditions claim she was drowned in a bog in Denmark, punished for her crimes by enemies who feared her even in old age. Other traditions simply let her fade away, an aging queen without a kingdom, her sons dead or scattered, her great ambitions reduced to ashes. The saga of the sons of Eric Bloodaxe is thus a saga of failure piled upon failure, of a family that rose to the highest ranks of Scandinavian royalty and fell again within 2 generations, destroyed by the same forces of violence and betrayal that had characterized their rise. By the end of the 10th century, the bloodline had been effectively eliminated from the political stage. Later, Norwegian kings traced their descent through other branches of Harald Fairhair's prolific family tree, and Eric and his children became cautionary tales rather than honored ancestors. And yet something survived. The memory survived, the name survived, the Eiríksmal survived, copied and recopied through the medieval centuries until it reached the hands of the Icelandic antiquarians who preserved it for modern scholarship. Eric Bloodaxe became part of the cultural inheritance of the North, one of the figures through whom later generations understood their own past, their own origins, their own identity as peoples descended from Vikings. This process of cultural appropriation has continued into the modern era, with results that range from the scholarly to the absurd. The 19th century rediscovered the Vikings as romantic heroes, noble savages uncorrupted by the decadence of civilization, and Eric fit easily into this imaginary. He was everything the Victorian imagination wanted Vikings to be. Fierce, violent, untamed, a warrior king from an age of iron before the soft modern world of commerce and industry had emasculated the European man. The fact that this image bore little relationship to the complex, sophisticated, commercially interconnected world of actual Viking Age Scandinavia mattered not at all. Eric became a symbol, and symbols need not be accurate. The 20th century took this symbolic Eric and ran with him. He appeared in novels, films, comics, and eventually video games, always more or less the same. A blood-soaked berserker, a half-savage king of a half-savage people, a figure of magnificent and terrible violence. The name Bloodaxe proved infinitely adaptable, attaching itself to sports teams, heavy metal bands, and countless works of popular fiction. Each generation recreated Eric in its own image, projecting onto him whatever anxieties or fantasies about masculinity, violence, and the past happened to be current at the moment. The historical Eric would not recognize himself in these appropriations, but then the historical Eric is mostly unavailable to us anyway. The sources are too thin, too contradictory, too filtered through the ideological concerns of later writers to give us confident access to the man who actually lived and died in the 10th century. What we have is a palimpsest, layers of representation built up over a millennium, each layer partially obscuring and partially revealing the layers beneath. The Eiríksmal's heroic warrior gives way to the saga's bloody tyrant, gives way to the Victorian romantic hero, gives way to the modern pop culture icon. Somewhere beneath all these representations, the historical Eric presumably exists, but he is buried too deep for easy recovery. Perhaps this is appropriate. Perhaps the most honest thing we can say about Eric Bloodaxe is that we do not know him, that the man himself has been lost to us and only the echoes of his name remain. History is full of such losses, figures who seemed important in their own time, but left too little evidence for later reconstruction. Eric left more than most. We have the poem, the saga accounts, the brief mentions in the English chronicles, and yet even this relatively rich documentation does not suffice to tell us who he truly was, what he thought and felt, what he hoped for and feared. What we can know is the shape of his world, the structures and pressures that constrained his choices and determined his fate. We can know that he was born into a violent political culture in which succession to kingship was decided by force rather than law, in which brothers were natural rivals and kin-killing was common. We can know that he came of age during the last great flowering of Viking military activity, when Scandinavian warriors still raided freely across Europe, and young men of good family were expected to prove themselves in combat abroad. We can know that he was caught up in the long transition from pagan to Christian Europe, a man of the old world living into the beginning of the new. We can know that he died fighting, as his culture demanded, and that his contemporaries believed this meant something, that it secured him a place in the hall of the gods. And we can know that a poet composed verses in his honor, verses that survived when so much else was lost, verses that fixed his image in the amber of literature and preserved it for ages that could no longer share the beliefs that animated their composition. The Eiriksmal is Eric's true monument, more permanent than any stone, more enduring than any kingdom. As long as there are readers of Old Norse poetry, and there will be readers as long as there are universities and libraries and people who care about the past, Eric Bloodaxe will be remembered. The poem ends with Eric and his 5 companion kings entering Valhalla, welcomed by the gods and the heroes who preceded them. Odin expresses his satisfaction that so great a warrior has finally arrived, explaining that he has summoned Eric because the fate of the world is uncertain and the All-Father must gather his best men for the battles to come. Eric asks why, if he has proven himself so mighty, Odin did not grant him victory in his earthly struggles. The god's answer is characteristically ambiguous. Because it is not known when the gray wolf will come for the seat of the gods. This is the logic of the old religion in its purest form. The gods do not promise worldly success. They promise only that courage matters, that the manner of one's death determines one's eternal destiny, that the universe has a shape and a purpose, even if that purpose requires the sacrifice of individual human happiness. Eric died a failure by worldly standards, driven from 2 thrones, betrayed by his followers, killed in a skirmish on a remote moor far from the halls of his ancestors. But in the poem's reckoning, these worldly failures are irrelevant. What matters is that he died fighting, that he proved himself worthy of Odin's hall, that when Ragnarok comes, he will stand beside the gods and face the final darkness with sword in hand. We cannot share this belief, but we can respect it. We can recognize in it a coherent response to the fundamental human problems of mortality and meaning, a way of organizing experience that gave purpose to suffering and dignity to death. The men who composed the Eiriksmal were not naive. They knew that Eric's life had been violent and troubled, that he had killed his brothers and been rejected by his people, that his end was lonely and bitter. They chose to remember him as a hero anyway, to emphasize what was admirable in him, and to fold the rest into the cosmic pattern that made even failure meaningful. Every culture does this with its dead. Every society tells stories about the past that serve the needs of the present, selecting and shaping the available evidence to create usable memories. The Eiriksmal is a particularly beautiful example of the form, but it is not essentially different from the monuments and memorials that every human community erects to honor those it wishes to remember. We are doing the same thing now, in this telling, shaping the fragmentary evidence of Eric's life into a narrative that speaks to our own concerns about violence and power and the fragility of human institutions. The telling is always a form of creation, a making of meaning out of raw material that has no inherent meaning of its own. And so we come to the end, to Stainmore, to the moor where a king died and an age concluded. The physical place remains, largely unchanged in its essential character since the day of the ambush. The road still winds through the pass, though it is paved now and carries motor traffic rather than horses and riders. The heather still covers the hillsides. The wind still moves across the open ground, carrying the smell of wet grass and distant sheep. On clear days, you can see for miles in every direction, the landscape unfolding in waves of green and brown toward horizons that seem impossibly far away. It is a fitting place for an ending. The high moors of northern England have always felt liminal, threshold spaces between the settled lowlands and the wilder uplands beyond, places where boundaries blur and categories dissolve. Eric died on a boundary, on the edge between one world and another, between the Viking north and the Christian south, between the old gods and the new, between the age of raiders and the age of states. His death marked a transition that was already underway but not yet complete, a turning that would take another century to fully accomplish. The last Viking king of York. The phrase has a finality to it that the moment itself lacked. Eric's killers did not know they were closing an era. The men who ambushed him on the Stainmore Road thought they were settling a political dispute. eliminating a troublesome rival, earning the gratitude and gold of the English king. They did not understand that they were ending something that could never be restored, that the Viking kingdom of York would never rise again, that the tradition of Norse rule in northern England had exhaled its last breath in the blood their swords had spilled. History rarely announces its turning points as they occur. The great transitions happen in confusion and violence and uncertainty, understood only in retrospect by those who have the luxury of hindsight. Eric's death was an event in time, a thing that happened on a particular day in a particular place to particular people with particular concerns and fears and hopes. It became a turning point only later, when chroniclers and historians looked back and saw the pattern, saw that nothing after was quite the same as anything before. The wind moves across Stainmore today, as it moved 1,000 years ago. The light falls on the grass as it fell on the day a king died there. The moor keeps no memory, preserves no record, offers no testimony about what occurred. If there were graves, they have vanished. If there were markers, they have been lost or misattributed. The land has absorbed the violence into itself and returned to its ancient indifference. The same indifference it will maintain long after we who tell this story have ourselves become subjects for future narration. What remains is what always remains: the words. The chronicle entries, brief and contradictory, fixing the event in historical time. The saga passages, elaborating and mythologizing, making story from silence. The Eriksmal, transforming death into apotheosis, defeat into triumph, the end of a life into the beginning of eternal glory. These fragments have outlasted everything else: the kingdoms and the kings, the halls and the ships, the swords and the bodies that wielded them. Language alone survives when all other monuments fail. A man was born into power in a violent age. He killed his brothers and claimed his father's throne. He was driven into exile by his own people. He found a second kingdom across the sea and ruled it badly. He was betrayed by men he trusted and killed on a moorland road far from his homeland. He left no dynasty, no buildings, no laws that bore his name. He left only a name that somehow, against all probability, refused to be forgotten. Eric Bloodaxe. The name still carries its charge after 1,000 years. It still conjures images, suggests stories, invites imagination. It has become separated from the man who bore it, floating free in cultural memory as a symbol detached from its original referent. The historical Eric is mostly lost, irretrievable, known only through the inadequate testimony of sources that did not understand him and could not preserve him whole. What survives is simpler and stranger: a name, a poem, a death on a moor, and the endless human hunger to know what came before us and to find meaning in what we find. The moor holds nothing now. The wind still moves, the gray sky stretches unbroken toward the sea. And somewhere beneath the heather, in soil that has been turned and planted and grazed for a millennium, there may still be a few flecks of rust that were once a king's sword, a few splinters of bone that were once a king's body, dissolved into the earth that received them and indistinguishable now from all the other matter that has accumulated over the long centuries. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the scavengers and the weather and the endless processes of decay have completed their work entirely, leaving nothing physical at all, no trace that science could detect or archaeology recover. It does not matter. The man is gone. The name remains. And in the end, that is how all of us will be remembered, if we are remembered at all, not as we were, but as the words that others chose to preserve about us, transformed by time and telling into something we would not recognize, something that belongs more to the tellers than to the told. The last Viking king of York lay dead in the rain. The rain has fallen 1 trillion times since then. He is still falling.